In the darkness of war, there are not just battles, but human stories of unimaginable suffering, survival, and loss. The Battle of Kiev in 1941 was not only one of the largest encirclements in history. It was a moment where hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians were trapped in a nightmare of fire, starvation, and despair. Tonight, we'll take you deep into those haunting days, where history becomes more than numbers. It becomes human. That if this kind of story grips your heart and keeps you thinking, I invite you to explore more cruel and heartbreaking experiences from my playlist Human Stories of History, where we share the voices of the past and the deadly struggles that shaped our world. If you find this content meaningful, please give it a like. It helps more than you can imagine. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to join us for more history told through the eyes of those who lived it. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Your support means everything. Together, let's remember, reflect, and never forget the human cost of history. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Road to Kiev. Prelude to a Catastrophe. The summer of 1941 was marked by thunder on the horizon, though it was not the storm of weather but of armies that would soon clash in a struggle of unimaginable scale. By June, the German Reich, at the height of its power, unleashed its vast military machine in an invasion of the Soviet Union. This campaign, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, stretched across an enormous front that reached from the Baltic to the Black Sea, covering a span greater than anything Europe had ever witnessed in modern war. Among the countless cities, rivers, and fields that lay in the path of the Wehrmacht, one stood out both for its symbolic and strategic weight. Kiev, the ancient capital of Ukraine, nestled along the Dnieper River, a city with roots deep in Slavic history, and now a cornerstone of Soviet defenses in the southwestern sector. The stage for one of the most devastating battles of the Second World War was already being prepared, though few could imagine the scale of the catastrophe that was to unfold. When Hitler launched his war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, his vision was not merely territorial conquest, but the destruction of what he regarded as Bolshevism itself. Ukraine, with its fertile black soil and immense agricultural resources, was viewed as a prize beyond measure. Control of Kiev was not just about capturing a city, but securing the gateway to Ukraine, the breadbasket that could fuel the German war machine for years to come. Yet the Soviet Union was not to be underestimated. Despite the shock of the invasion and the destruction of much of its border armies, the Soviet leadership, under Stalin, clung to the belief that major cities could and must be held, even against impossible odds. Kiev became a symbol of resistance, but also of tragic overextension, as hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops would eventually be trapped in one of history's greatest encirclements in the weeks immediately following the invasion. The German advance was breathtaking in its speed. Panzer spearheads cut through Soviet defenses, enveloping and destroying entire armies in Belorussia, particularly in the battles near Minsk and Smolensk. Yet in the south, progress was slower. The terrain was more difficult, the distances longer, and the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, offered more determined resistance than expected. The Red Army, though battered, fought fiercely in the fields of western Ukraine, buying precious time for Moscow to regroup. Still, the pressure was immense. German Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, pushed relentlessly eastward, its divisions supported by armored groups under generals like Ewald von Kleist. The city of Kiev, defended by a sprawling network of Soviet armies, stood directly in their path. For Stalin, Kiev was non-negotiable. The Soviet dictator, deeply distrustful of retreat, issued harsh orders forbidding withdrawals. He remembered the humiliations of World War I and was convinced that yielding ground would only demoralize the Soviet people. Kiev was not only a fortress of military importance, but also a political and psychological anchor in Ukraine. To abandon it seemed unthinkable, even as German armor probed dangerously along its flanks. In early July, Hitler's generals debated where the decisive blow should fall. Some argued for a direct drive on Moscow, believing that the Soviet capital was the true heart of resistance. Others, including Hitler himself, saw the South as equally vital, both for resources and for the destruction of large Soviet forces that might otherwise regroup and counterattack. The fate of Kiev was thus tied not only to geography, but to the very strategic disputes within the German High Command. By late July, the front was already shaping into a precarious line for the Soviets. The Southwestern Front held its positions around Kiev, but was increasingly exposed. To the north, German Army Group Center threatened Moscow, while to the south the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into Ukraine. Yet Soviet intelligence failed to grasp the full danger. Communications were disrupted, reconnaissance was often misleading, and Stalin's own refusal to consider a retreat blinded his commanders to the growing trap. Meanwhile, the German leadership began to refine its plan. The idea of a massive pincer, one arm striking from the north through the Gomel region, and the other from the south near the Black Sea approaches, began to take form. The jaws of this encirclement would eventually meet east of Kiev, closing on hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops like an iron cage. For the ordinary soldier, both German and Soviet, the summer was one of endless marches, battles, and exhaustion. German panzer crews, hardened by victories in France and the Balkans, pressed forward under the blistering sun, their tanks raising clouds of dust across the steppe. Soviet infantrymen, many poorly trained and hastily mobilized, dug trenches and erected defenses around Kiev, determined to hold the line despite shortages of food, ammunition, and sleep. Civilians, caught in the middle, fled eastward with their belongings piled on wagons, or sought refuge in the cellars of the city as the thunder of artillery grew nearer. The fate of Kiev loomed over all like a gathering storm, and though the outcome was not yet written, the elements of disaster were falling into place. Each day brought the German army closer to the point where its two great armored pincers would snap shut, sealing a pocket so vast that it would become the largest encirclement of the entire war. This was the road to Kiev, paved with ambition, fear, and the relentless momentum of modern war. The catastrophe had not yet arrived, but its shadow was already lengthening, and those caught in its path would soon find themselves in the heart of one of the most tragic chapters of human conflict. The vast plains of Ukraine in 1941 seemed endless, a sea of golden fields stretching under a burning sun. Across this landscape, armies clashed in movements so large they defied imagination. The Wehrmacht's advance toward Kiev was not a single thrust, but part of a gigantic war machine grinding forward on multiple axes, each division pushing eastward with the confidence of past victories. Yet Kiev was no ordinary objective. It was a city steeped in symbolism, often called the mother of Russian cities, a cradle of Slavic culture and Orthodox faith. To Hitler, however, it was nothing more than a prize to be conquered, a stepping stone toward domination of the East. To Stalin, Kiev was a fortress that must never be abandoned, its defense a matter of both pride and survival. This clash of perceptions ensured that the battle for Kiev would become a contest of wills as much as strategy. In early August, the German High Command found itself at a crossroads. Army Group Center had driven deep into Soviet territory and stood within reach of Moscow. Many of Hitler's generals, including the celebrated Heinz Guderian, urged a direct assault on the Soviet capital, convinced that capturing Moscow would cripple Soviet communications, morale, and supply systems. But Hitler was not persuaded. Obsessed with resources, he turned his gaze southward. He envisioned Ukraine as the breadbasket of the Reich, the source of grain, coal, and industry that could sustain a long war. Thus, he ordered a shift in focus. The panzers of Army Group Center would wheel southward to encircle Soviet forces in Ukraine, joining with Kleist's Panzer Group in a colossal pincer movement aimed at Kiev. This decision, controversial at the time, sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers who remained in place under Stalin's rigid orders. For the men of the Red Army, the order to stand fast was both a command and a death sentence. General Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, understood the danger all too well. Reports from the field made it clear that German armor was maneuvering to envelop his armies. He pleaded for permission to withdraw, to regroup east of the Dnieper where the line might be shortened and defenses more secure. But Stalin, deeply suspicious of any commander who proposed retreat, dismissed such requests. To him, talk of withdrawal sounded like defeatism, even betrayal. He had already issued his infamous "not a step back" directives and expected Kiev to be held regardless of cost. Kirponos, loyal but constrained, obeyed, even as the noose tightened. Meanwhile, German preparations grew ever more precise. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group began its pivot southward in late August, leaving the Moscow axis and driving through the Gomel region. The movement was bold, stretching supply lines and risking exposure, but its goal was nothing less than to trap the entire Soviet Southwestern Front. To the south, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group pressed northward from the lower Dnieper. Between them lay the Soviet forces around Kiev, more than 500,000 men who still believed they were defending a strong position. Day by day, the German pincers drew closer, like wolves circling their prey. It was a maneuver of breathtaking ambition, the kind that made the German blitzkrieg so feared. If successful, it would eclipse even the great encirclements of Minsk and Smolensk earlier in the campaign. In Kiev itself, life was grim and uncertain. The city, with its wide boulevards and historic churches, now echoed with the tramp of soldiers and the rumble of artillery. Barricades rose along key streets, anti-tank ditches were dug on the outskirts, and civilians were pressed into labor to strengthen defenses. Rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed the Germans were on the verge of collapse. Others whispered that an encirclement was imminent. Families debated whether to flee eastward or remain in their homes, torn between fear of occupation and the hazards of flight. For many, there was simply no choice. Trains were overloaded, roads clogged with refugees, and the advancing war made escape almost impossible. Thus, the population of Kiev braced itself for what was to come, caught between loyalty to the Soviet cause and the instinct to survive. By early September, the trap was closing. Guderian's tanks surged southward, smashing through Soviet units too disorganized to resist effectively. Bridges were captured, rivers forded, towns burned in the path of the panzers. The speed of the advance left Soviet commanders reeling, unable to coordinate a coherent defense. At the same time, Kleist's armor thrust northward with equal determination, cutting off Soviet lines of communication and supply. Alarm spread through the Soviet high command, but Stalin still refused to authorize withdrawal. He believed the Germans had overextended themselves and that counterattacks might yet restore the situation. His refusal to recognize the scale of the threat sealed the doom of Kirponos's armies. As the German pincers converged east of Kiev, the encirclement became inevitable. By mid-September, the jaws of the trap closed near the town of Lokvitsa, more than 100 miles east of Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops found themselves surrounded, cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and escape. It was one of the largest encirclements in military history, a disaster on a scale that defied comprehension. Yet in those early days of September, the soldiers in Kiev and the surrounding countryside still clung to hope. They fought stubbornly, manning their positions with grim determination, unaware that they were already condemned. The road to Kiev had become the road to catastrophe, a path that led not to victory or even survival, but to one of the most devastating defeats the Red Army would ever suffer. The stage was set. The armies were in motion, the decisions had been made, and the fate of Kiev was sealed by the choices of leaders far from the battlefield. In the weeks ahead, the encirclement would be completed, the fighting intensified, and the scale of the disaster revealed. But already in late summer 1941, the outlines of tragedy were clear. The Germans had chosen their target, the Soviets had been ordered to hold, and the ancient city of Kiev was about to become the site of one of the greatest calamities in the history of warfare. Chapter 2: Operation Barbarossa and the German Advance into Ukraine. When the German Reich launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the world witnessed the opening of the largest land invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of troops from Axis allies, stormed across an immense front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Their objective was nothing less than the destruction of the Soviet Union in a lightning campaign, one that Hitler believed would bring the Red Army to collapse within a matter of months. Among the three great axes of advance, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south into Ukraine, the southern drive would prove both decisive and costly. The fate of Kiev was intimately tied to this grand opening, as the German Army Group South pressed into the heart of Ukraine, intent on seizing its vast resources and eliminating Soviet resistance. The German war machine moved with a speed that astonished observers. Panzers surged forward in long columns. Aircraft of the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and motorized infantry followed in their wake. The Blitzkrieg, tested in Poland and perfected in France, now rolled eastward with even greater ferocity. In the opening days, the Soviet border defenses were shattered. Airfields were bombed with devastating effect. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Communications collapsed, commanders were cut off from their units, and panic rippled through the ranks of the Red Army. Entire divisions disintegrated under the shock of the German assault. Yet the Southern Front presented challenges different from those in the north and center. The distances were longer, the terrain more varied, and the Soviet Southwestern Front, unlike its northern counterparts, fought with a stubbornness that surprised the invaders. General Mikhail Kirponos, a commander respected by his men for his calm demeanor and personal courage, faced the task of defending Ukraine against this massive assault. His Southwestern Front was large but stretched thin, and many of its units were poorly trained or inadequately equipped. Nonetheless, Kirponos understood the stakes. Ukraine was not only a vital agricultural region but also home to key industries, rail networks, and cities like Kiev, Kharkov, and Odessa. Losing Ukraine would not only deprive the Soviet Union of resources but also open the road to the Caucasus and its oil fields. Thus, from the very beginning of Barbarossa, the battle for Ukraine became a struggle of immense importance, both strategically and symbolically. For the German side, Army Group South was commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a veteran officer whose career stretched back to the First World War. Rundstedt's forces were immense. the 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist, the 6th Army under Walter von Reichenau, and the 11th Army under Eugen Ritter von Schabert. These armies, supported by Romanian and Hungarian allies, pushed eastward with the aim of smashing the Soviet defenses, capturing Kiev, and securing the Dnieper River line. But unlike the rapid advances seen in Belorussia by Army Group Center, progress in Ukraine was slower and harder fought. The Soviets defended stubbornly, and the geography favored defensive operations. The Pripyat marshes created natural barriers in the north, while the great rivers, the Bug, the Dniester, and ultimately the Dnieper, provided formidable obstacles to mechanized warfare. The first great clashes came in the frontier battles of late June and early July. Near Brody and Dubno, one of the largest tank battles of the early war erupted as Soviet armored forces attempted to counterattack the advancing panzers. Thousands of tanks clashed in fields and forests, a chaotic struggle of steel and fire. The Red Army's tanks included some of the newest models, the T-34 and the KV-1, machines that shocked the Germans with their armor and firepower. Yet despite their technical advantages, the Soviets suffered from poor coordination, lack of fuel, and inadequate communications. The result was devastating losses. The Germans, with their superior tactics and tight integration of air and ground forces, gradually overwhelmed the Soviet counterattacks. Still, the ferocity of the fighting gave the Wehrmacht pause, as they realized the Red Army was not as brittle as they had hoped. In the skies, the Luftwaffe extended its dominance. German pilots, experienced from campaigns in Spain and Western Europe, inflicted heavy losses on Soviet aviation. Bombing raids struck not only military targets, but also railroads, bridges, and cities, disrupting Soviet attempts to mobilize reserves. Yet the sheer size of the Soviet Union presented challenges for the Luftwaffe as well. Distances were vast, supply lines grew thin, and the Soviets, despite terrible losses, continued to produce aircraft at a rate that astonished German intelligence. Even as squadrons were wiped out, replacements emerged from the east, a testament to Soviet resilience and industrial capacity. The German advance into Ukraine was not simply a military operation, but also a campaign of terror. Following Hitler's ideological vision of Lebensraum, the Wehrmacht was accompanied by SS units and Einsatzgruppen, whose mission was the extermination of Jews, communists, and other groups deemed enemies of the Reich. As villages fell under German control, massacres occurred, and the civilian population faced harsh repression. Ukraine's fertile land was coveted for German settlers, and the local population was treated as expendable. These brutal policies deepened Soviet resolve to resist, even as morale was shaken by defeats. Civilians found themselves in an impossible position, caught between the horrors of occupation and the heavy hand of Soviet rule, which punished retreat or desertion with equal ruthlessness. As July turned to August, the pressure on Kiev grew. German forces advanced steadily, though not without cost. Soviet units, retreating but not collapsing, fought delaying actions, slowing the Wehrmacht's progress. The Dnieper loomed as a natural defensive barrier, and Stalin ordered that it be held at all costs. Kiev, lying on the west bank of the river, became the focal point of the struggle. Kirponos positioned his armies to defend the city, but the danger was already apparent. German armored groups were maneuvering not only for a frontal assault, but for a vast encirclement that would trap his forces. Still, orders from Moscow were unyielding. Kiev must be defended, no matter the price. Thus, as Operation Barbarossa surged into its second month, the battle for Ukraine intensified, and the fate of Kiev hung in the balance. tied inexorably to the great gamble Hitler had unleashed that June morning. As August 1941 progressed, the German advance into Ukraine gathered momentum. Army Group South, with its panzers at the forefront, moved through open plains and along critical rail lines, exploiting every weakness in the Soviet defensive network. The Red Army, despite repeated warnings and reconnaissance reports, struggled to organize effective countermeasures. Stalin's insistence on holding ground rather than retreating to more defensible positions meant that Soviet units were increasingly stretched, often encircled in smaller skirmishes even before the great trap around Kiev had fully formed. Communication breakdowns were rampant, orders were delayed or misinterpreted, and the sheer size of the front created pockets of vulnerability that the German generals were quick to exploit. The German commanders were acutely aware of these weaknesses. Guderian, a master of armored warfare, pressed forward with precision, orchestrating the movement of his Panzer Corps to cut off retreat paths and isolate Soviet divisions. Von Kleist coordinated with infantry and motorized support, ensuring that flanks were secured and supply lines maintained, despite the vast distances. Each maneuver was calculated, a blend of audacious risk and disciplined execution. German artillery and air support worked in tandem with the advancing panzers, softening Soviet positions and preventing reinforcements from reaching threatened sectors. The pace of the offensive left little time for Soviet units to recover, regroup, or mount effective counterattacks. Meanwhile, the human cost of this advance became increasingly visible. Civilians in the path of the German army faced displacement, destruction, and terror. Villages were burned as part of scorched earth tactics, railways were sabotaged or destroyed, and bridges demolished to slow the German advance. For many Ukrainians, the arrival of the Wehrmacht brought not liberation but fear, as the Nazis implemented harsh occupation policies and targeted perceived enemies of the Reich. Simultaneously, the Soviet regime demanded absolute loyalty, punishing commanders and civilians who attempted to retreat or flee with imprisonment or execution. The civilian population was caught in a lethal vice between two totalitarian powers, a tragic witness to the relentless momentum of war. Despite these challenges, Soviet commanders attempted to organize resistance. General Kirponos and his staff focused on using terrain to their advantage, fortifying towns, rivers, and forests to delay German advances. Small counterattacks were launched in an effort to slow the panzers, often achieving limited tactical success but failing to alter the overall course of the campaign. Soviet troops, many of whom were conscripted and poorly trained, fought with extraordinary courage, often outnumbered and outgunned. Every engagement, every delay, contributed to the broader picture of resistance, buying time for the evacuation of civilians and the reorganization of units further east. Yet, the encroaching German forces, masters of maneuver warfare, remained relentless. The operational complexity of the German advance into Ukraine was immense. Coordination between multiple army groups, panzers, infantry, and Luftwaffe units required constant communication and adaptability. Logistics were a persistent challenge. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be transported across hundreds of miles of terrain, much of it under threat of partisan activity or poor road conditions. Supply lines stretched thin, yet the German command maintained its offensive tempo through careful planning and ruthless prioritization. Meanwhile, Soviet forces struggled not only with material shortages, but also with command interference from Moscow, where Stalin's insistence on holding ground restricted flexibility. The result was a clash not just of armies but of strategic philosophies, each side attempting to impose its will on a chaotic and fluid battlefield. By early September, the German advance had brought its forces to the outskirts of key cities and rail junctions in Ukraine. The pincers of Army Group South were moving into positions that would eventually encircle Soviet forces around Kiev, though the full scale of the maneuver was not yet apparent to the defenders. Reconnaissance units reported German movements to Soviet commanders, but the information was often incomplete or contradictory, leaving them uncertain of the Wehrmacht's ultimate objectives. German air superiority compounded the confusion as reconnaissance flights, bombing raids, and strafing missions disrupted Soviet communications and morale. The Soviet forces, already exhausted from continuous retreats and engagements, faced the grim reality that their position was increasingly untenable. Even as the Germans closed in, the strategic significance of Ukraine remained clear. Beyond Kiev, the region contained vast agricultural lands, industrial centers, and critical transportation networks. Control of these areas would provide the Germans not only with food and raw materials, but also with leverage over the Soviet war economy. For Hitler, the capture of Ukraine was therefore both an immediate tactical necessity and a long-term strategic goal. Every division, every armored corps was directed toward this prize, and the advance became more than a series of battles. It became a relentless push to annihilate enemy forces and seize territory before Soviet reinforcements could stabilize the front. As the first month of the campaign drew to a close, the contours of disaster for the Soviet Southwestern Front were becoming increasingly visible. German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Ukrainian territory, forcing continuous retreats and exposing the vulnerabilities of Soviet positions. The stage was being set for one of the largest encirclements in history, a maneuver that would soon engulf hundreds of thousands of soldiers and seal the fate of Kiev. Operation Barbarossa, initially conceived as a rapid strike to destroy the Soviet Union, was achieving its objectives in the south through a combination of speed, tactical brilliance, and relentless pressure, even as the human cost mounted and the resilience of the Red Army foreshadowed a struggle that would last far longer than Hitler had anticipated. Chapter 3: Soviet Defenses and the Role of the Southwestern Front. As the summer of 1941 deepened, the Soviet Union faced the full force of the German Blitzkrieg, a relentless tide of mechanized warfare that swept across its western borders with shocking speed. Nowhere was the challenge more acute than in Ukraine, where the Southwestern Front under General Mikhail Kirponos bore the brunt of the German Army Group South's advance. The Southwestern Front was a sprawling formation, encompassing multiple armies, corps, and countless divisions, each charged with the defense of one of the most strategically vital regions of the Soviet Union. Its responsibility was immense: to protect Kiev, the Dnieper River line, and the industrial and agricultural heartlands of Ukraine, all while countering an enemy who had perfected the art of rapid, decisive operations. The success or failure of this front would influence not only the fate of Ukraine, but also the wider course of the Eastern Front. And yet the forces under Kirponos were fighting a battle defined by both bravery and desperation. The Soviet defensive strategy in the Southwest was shaped by a combination of geography, military doctrine, and political pressure from Moscow. The Dnieper River was the natural anchor of the defense, a wide and formidable barrier that could, in theory, slow or halt German advances. Soviet engineers, laborers, and soldiers worked feverishly to construct fortifications, from trenches and anti-tank obstacles to bridges rigged for demolition. Urban centers, particularly Kiev, were fortified with barricades, street blockages, and improvised strongpoints intended to slow the enemy's mechanized units. Kirponos relied on these preparations to create depth in his defenses, hoping that delaying the Germans would allow reinforcements to arrive from the east. Yet the very scale of the front made comprehensive defense nearly impossible. The Southwestern Front stretched hundreds of miles, its forces thinly distributed, and many units were poorly equipped or inadequately trained, having been hurriedly mobilized after the initial shock of Operation Barbarossa. The composition of the Southwestern Front was diverse and complex. It included both regular Red Army divisions and hastily formed militia units, each with differing levels of training, morale, and combat effectiveness. Artillery units, essential for slowing German armor, were often short on shells or positioned too far forward to be fully effective. Infantry units faced shortages of rifles, machine guns, and other essential equipment, while armored divisions were still recovering from earlier losses in the border battles. Despite these deficiencies, Soviet commanders attempted to organize a coherent defensive system. Headquarters were established to coordinate the movement of reserves, allocate reinforcements to critical sectors, and manage the distribution of supplies. But the challenges were enormous. Communications were unreliable, often disrupted by German air attacks or sabotage, and the sheer size of the front made timely coordination nearly impossible. The defenders of Ukraine were fighting not only an enemy of extraordinary capability, but also the limitations of their own organization. The German threat to the Southwestern Front was both numerical and tactical. Army Group South possessed vast amounts of armor, mechanized infantry, and artillery, supported by the Luftwaffe's air superiority. Panzer divisions moved in concentrated formations, striking at weak points in the Soviet lines, bypassing strong points, and encircling units that attempted to hold ground. The Germans had learned from earlier campaigns that speed and mobility were critical, and they employed these lessons with ruthless precision in Ukraine. Their air forces disrupted communications and supply lines, bombed defensive positions, and created chaos behind Soviet lines. This combination of firepower, mobility, and coordination placed the Southwestern Front in a precarious position, one in which every day brought new dangers and forced improvisation at the highest levels of command. Despite the overwhelming odds, Soviet units fought with tenacity. Infantrymen dug into fields, forests, and urban positions, creating obstacles and defensive lines wherever possible. Tank crews, though often outnumbered and outgunned, conducted counterattacks to slow German advances. Artillerymen targeted the flanks of approaching panzer formations, while engineers prepared demolitions to deny bridges and key crossings to the enemy. Each action, each small delay, was critical in a battle defined by speed and maneuver. For commanders like Kirponos, the challenge was to integrate these disparate efforts into a coordinated defense that could buy time and prevent a complete collapse. Morale was a constant concern. Soldiers faced exhaustion, hunger, and the constant threat of encirclement, yet they were driven by a mix of duty, fear, and loyalty to the Soviet cause. The political dimension of the Southwestern Front's defense was equally significant. Stalin's insistence on holding Kiev and other key positions constrained the options available to commanders. Retreat, even when tactically necessary, was often interpreted as failure or treason. Orders from Moscow demanded steadfastness, and this rigid adherence to directives created tension between the frontline commanders and the high command. Kirponos found himself navigating a delicate balance, obeying orders while attempting to preserve his forces for the inevitable battles that would follow. The resulting defensive strategy was therefore a mixture of improvisation, cautious engagement, and staunch resistance, constrained by political imperatives that often ran counter to military logic. Logistics added another layer of difficulty. Supplying hundreds of thousands of troops across a vast and fluid front was a monumental task. Railways had been damaged by retreating Soviet forces or attacked by the Luftwaffe. Roads were congested with troops and refugees, and shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food were constant concerns. Resupply efforts were often delayed or diverted, leaving units in critical positions under strength or unable to conduct sustained operations. These shortages compounded the challenges of coordinating a defensive system over such a wide area, forcing commanders to make difficult decisions about where to concentrate their limited resources. Every delay, every miscommunication, risked creating gaps in the lines that the Germans could exploit. By late August, it was becoming clear that the Southwestern Front faced not only an advancing enemy, but a battle of attrition unlike any in recent memory. The Germans had perfected the art of combining mobility, firepower, and tactical innovation, while Soviet forces were simultaneously constrained by political directives, logistical challenges, and uneven training. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic confrontations of the early Eastern Front, the Encirclement of Kiev. The Southwestern Front, with all its bravery, complexity, and challenges, would soon be tested to its limits as the Wehrmacht executed a maneuver designed to trap hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a tactical masterpiece that would have consequences reverberating throughout the war. As August turned into September 1941, the Soviet Southwestern Front faced an increasingly perilous situation. German forces, advancing with remarkable speed, had begun to exploit gaps in the Soviet lines, probing weak points and concentrating their armored formations where resistance was thinnest. For General Kirponos, the challenges were mounting by the day. His units, already stretched across hundreds of miles of territory, were facing constant attacks, while supplies and reinforcements from the east were delayed or diverted due to the chaos created by the German advance. The Red Army strategy was one of stubborn defense, relying on fortifications, counterattacks, and the natural terrain to slow the enemy. But even as these efforts bought time, the threat of encirclement became increasingly apparent. The geography of the Southwestern Front both aided and complicated Soviet defensive efforts. Wide river valleys, dense forests, and marshes created natural obstacles that could be used to channel enemy movements and strengthen defensive positions. Engineers constructed fortifications along these lines, building trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions to resist German advances. Urban centers such as Kiev were transformed into defensive hubs, with barricades erected across streets, key intersections fortified, and artillery positioned to dominate approaches. Despite these preparations, the length of the front and the mobility of German panzer divisions made it difficult to hold these positions effectively. Units could be bypassed, cut off, or overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive, creating a constant tension along the defensive lines. Soviet command and control faced severe challenges. Communications were disrupted by German air raids, sabotage, and the sheer chaos of continuous engagements. Orders from Moscow were often delayed or unclear, and the insistence on holding positions at all costs limited the flexibility of commanders in the field. Kirponos struggled to reconcile the demands from above with the realities on the ground. He understood that a rigid defense, though politically mandated, risked total encirclement of his armies. Nevertheless, he sought to coordinate counterattacks and delaying actions wherever possible, hoping to slow the Germans long enough to allow reserves to stabilize the lines or prepare fallback positions further east. This balancing act between obedience and pragmatism defined the Southwestern Front's approach during these critical weeks. The Soviet forces themselves displayed remarkable resilience under these conditions. Infantry units, many composed of hastily mobilized recruits, fought with determination despite inadequate training and shortages of equipment. Tank crews, though often outnumbered and facing superior German tactics, conducted repeated counterattacks aimed at disrupting enemy advances and buying time for infantry and artillery units. Artillery batteries, despite limited ammunition, targeted German armor and supply columns with precision whenever possible. Soldiers dug into every defensible position, using natural and man-made obstacles to their advantage. These efforts, while heroic, could not change the strategic reality. The Germans were executing a highly coordinated maneuver designed to encircle the Southwestern Front entirely. German air power continued to compound Soviet difficulties. The Luftwaffe maintained near-total control of the skies, conducting reconnaissance, bombing defensive positions, and interdicting Soviet supply routes. These air operations disrupted coordination and communication, causing delays in reinforcements and the distribution of ammunition, and creating a psychological burden on soldiers constantly under threat from above. Civilians were also affected, as air raids targeted infrastructure and cities, contributing to the chaos and uncertainty within the Soviet rear. The combination of ground and air pressure created a relentless operational tempo that the Southwestern Front was struggling to absorb as German forces approached key junctions and river crossings. The threat of encirclement became increasingly imminent. Guderian's panzer units advanced from the north while Kleist's forces moved from the south, aiming to meet east of Kiev and trap the Soviet armies in a pocket. Soviet reconnaissance reported these movements, but the scale of the threat was difficult to comprehend, and Moscow's orders continued to emphasize holding positions rather than retreating to avoid entrapment. Kirponos and his staff attempted to maneuver units to counter the converging pincers, but the speed and coordination of the German advance made it nearly impossible to respond effectively. Every day, Soviet divisions were forced to fight delaying actions, falling back under pressure while trying to maintain cohesion and communication. The human element of the Southwestern Front was critical. Soldiers endured long marches, limited rations, and the constant stress of combat. Fatigue and uncertainty weighed heavily, yet discipline and resilience were maintained through a combination of leadership, ideological motivation, and sheer necessity. Officers encouraged their men to hold positions at all costs, emphasizing the importance of defending Kiev and the broader strategic objectives of the front. Civilians, while not formally part of the military effort, were drawn into support roles, constructing fortifications, evacuating supplies, and assisting in logistical operations wherever possible. The interplay between military units and the local population created a complex social dimension to the defense of the Southwestern Front. Despite these extraordinary efforts, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. German armored units increasingly bypassed strongpoints, cutting supply lines and isolating Soviet formations. Delays in reinforcements and inadequate reserves left gaps in the lines, and repeated counterattacks, though courageous, were often unsustainable. The Southwestern Front's defenses, while formidable in parts, were being systematically weakened by attrition, maneuver, and the overwhelming coordination of German forces. By early September, it was clear that the front faced a dire threat. Encirclement was imminent, and the struggle for Kiev was entering its most critical phase. The bravery, ingenuity, and resilience of the Soviet forces, remarkable as they were, would soon be tested in one of the largest and most tragic encirclements of the Second World War. Chapter 4. The Strategic Importance of Kiev and Hitler's Plans. By the summer of 1941, as the German war machine pushed deep into Soviet territory, the city of Kiev had emerged as a focal point of strategic significance. Unlike other objectives along the Eastern Front, Kiev was not merely a military target to be seized and occupied. It was a nexus of political, logistical, and psychological importance that would shape Hitler's plans for the South. Nestled on the banks of the Dnieper River, Kiev had long served as a historic, cultural, and administrative hub of Ukraine, with roots stretching back over a millennium. For Hitler, however, historical reverence held little weight. The city represented a gateway to the fertile lands of Ukraine, the industrial resources of the region, and the broader objective of crippling the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war. Capturing Kiev was not optional. It was central to the Reich's operational vision, and failure to secure it could jeopardize the entire southern advance. Hitler's strategic calculus regarding Kiev was intertwined with his broader objectives in the east. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with advancing into Ukraine, capturing key cities, and eliminating Soviet resistance. Hitler saw Ukraine as essential for two primary reasons: its agricultural wealth and its industrial potential. The breadbasket of Europe would supply grain for the German population and military, while factories and transportation hubs could be repurposed to sustain the Wehrmacht. Within this framework, Kiev occupied a unique position. It was both a logistical hub controlling access to rail and river networks, and a symbolic prize whose capture would signal German dominance in the southwest. Hitler believed that by taking Kiev, he could disrupt Soviet command and control, isolate large portions of the Red Army, and secure a stepping stone for further operations toward the Donbass and beyond. The city's geography further amplified its strategic value. Located along the Dnieper, Kiev offered a natural defensive barrier for the Soviets and an essential crossing point for advancing armies. Its rail networks connected central Ukraine to the eastern territories, while the surrounding plains allowed for rapid armored movement, a feature the Germans sought to exploit through pincer maneuvers and mechanized thrusts. To Hitler and his generals, controlling Kiev meant not only neutralizing a Soviet stronghold, but also opening routes for further exploitation of the southern territories. The German High Command recognized that a failure to capture the city promptly could allow Soviet forces to regroup, reinforce positions, and potentially threaten the operational integrity of Army Group South. Thus, the strategic imperative was clear: Kiev must fall, and it must fall swiftly. The decision to prioritize Kiev also reflected Hitler's broader approach to the Eastern Front. Unlike some of his generals, who advocated a concentrated thrust toward Moscow, Hitler insisted on addressing multiple objectives simultaneously. He viewed the southern theater as vital for resource acquisition and encirclement operations. By trapping Soviet forces around Kiev, the Germans could achieve not only a tactical victory, but also a psychological one, demonstrating the inevitability of German dominance and undermining Soviet morale. This dual purpose, practical and symbolic, explains why the encirclement of Kiev became one of the most ambitious maneuvers of the early Eastern Front. The Pincer movement planned by Guderian's and Kleist's panzer groups was designed to crush the Southwestern Front, secure the city, and facilitate subsequent advances into central and eastern Ukraine. From the perspective of the German operational planners, Kiev also represented a test of combined arms warfare on a scale rarely seen. The coordination required between mechanized infantry, artillery, air support, and logistical units was immense. Guderian's panzers would advance rapidly from the north, Kleist's forces from the south, and infantry and artillery units were tasked with consolidating captured positions. Air superiority provided reconnaissance, interdiction, and close support. Every element of the German war machine had to work in concert to ensure the success of the encirclement. Any misstep could allow Soviet forces to escape or counterattack, potentially unraveling months of careful planning. The operation was, therefore, both a demonstration of military engineering and a gamble that relied heavily on speed, surprise, and precise execution. The German planners were also keenly aware of the human and psychological dimensions of the Kiev operation. The capture of the city would not only yield material gains, but also demoralize Soviet forces across the region. Army Group South sought to inflict maximum disruption on Soviet command structures, seizing communication centers, transport hubs, and key administrative offices. Hitler believed that the fall of Kiev would convince the Soviet leadership of the futility of resistance in Ukraine, potentially triggering further retreats and surrenders. The encirclement plan was thus as much psychological warfare as a military maneuver, designed to break the will of the Red Army even before the last pockets of resistance had been eliminated. For the Soviets, the strategic importance of Kiev was equally apparent. Stalin's orders to hold the city at all costs reflected a desire to maintain control over Ukraine and preserve Soviet prestige. Losing Kiev without a fight would have been a blow to morale, a symbol of weakness, and a potential catalyst for widespread panic. Kirponos and his staff understood that defending the city was a matter of both survival and principle. Yet as the German pincers drew closer, it became clear that defending Kiev was fraught with danger. The combination of Hitler's obsession with the city, the operational brilliance of the Wehrmacht, and Stalin's rigid directives created a situation in which the Southwestern Front was increasingly vulnerable to encirclement, and the stage was set for one of the largest and most catastrophic battles of the Eastern Front. The strategic significance of Kiev extended beyond immediate military objectives. Control of the city would affect supply lines, communications, and regional governance, making it a critical linchpin for the German advance into southern Russia. Hitler viewed its capture as a necessary step toward the eventual conquest of the Soviet Union, while the Soviets recognized that its defense was essential to maintaining cohesion across the Southwestern theater. This convergence of operational, logistical, and symbolic factors elevated Kiev from a mere target to a centerpiece of the conflict, ensuring that the battle for the city would become one of the defining engagements of the early months of Operation Barbarossa. As September 1941 progressed, the German High Command intensified its preparations for the capture of Kiev, fully aware that the city represented both an operational pivot and a symbol of Soviet resistance. Hitler's obsession with seizing Ukraine's capital was matched only by his desire to deliver a decisive blow to the Red Army, crippling its ability to resist further advances into the south. Army Group South, under Rundstedt, coordinated closely with panzer groups led by Guderian and Kleist to execute a massive pincer maneuver aimed at encircling the Soviet Southwestern Front. This was no ordinary offensive. It required careful timing, flawless coordination, and the ability to maintain momentum over vast distances. The Germans understood that speed was critical, that any delay could allow Kirponos to organize a breakout or reinforce key positions, and that the success of the operation depended on both military precision and ruthless determination. The encirclement plan was audacious. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advanced from the north, pushing through the Gomel and Chernihiv regions to cut off the approaches to Kiev from that direction. Simultaneously, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group drove northward from the southern Dnieper basin, threatening the flanks and rear of Soviet formations. The objective was to link these two armored thrusts east of Kiev, trapping hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers in a massive pocket. Infantry and artillery units were tasked with consolidating captured positions, defending supply lines, and preventing Soviet forces from breaking out prematurely. Air support provided reconnaissance, close combat assistance, and interdiction of enemy movements. The coordination of these elements exemplified the Blitzkrieg doctrine in its most extreme application, demonstrating the German reliance on rapid movement, combined arms integration, and decisive action to achieve strategic objectives. From Hitler's perspective, the importance of Kiev extended beyond immediate military considerations. The city's fall would have significant symbolic value, signaling the superiority of German arms and the inevitability of Soviet defeat. Capturing Kiev would demonstrate that the Wehrmacht could not only penetrate deep into Soviet territory, but also execute large-scale encirclements, effectively paralyzing the enemy's capacity for organized resistance. Hitler believed that such a victory would also destabilize the Soviet leadership, potentially leading to internal dissent, the collapse of command structures, and the psychological demoralization of troops across the Southwestern Front. In Hitler's mind, the city represented a linchpin for both operational success and strategic intimidation, making its capture a high priority. For the Soviet command, the strategic stakes of Kiev were equally clear. Stalin's insistence on holding the city at all costs reflected a combination of political, military, and psychological considerations. Losing Kiev would not only mean the loss of a key logistical hub, but also a major blow to morale, undermining confidence in the Red Army and potentially triggering panic across other fronts. The city's defense was intended to tie down German forces, buying time for reserves to arrive and preventing further incursions into central Ukraine. Kirponos and his staff recognized that defending Kiev would require extraordinary coordination, improvisation, and endurance, yet they faced the difficult reality of an enemy executing a maneuver designed to envelop them completely. The juxtaposition of Hitler's offensive determination and Stalin's rigid defensive mandate created a deadly tension that would define the ensuing battle. The logistical importance of Kiev cannot be overstated. The city controlled critical rail lines connecting central Ukraine to the eastern territories, allowing for the movement of troops, supplies, and industrial resources. Its capture by the Germans would sever these connections, isolate Soviet formations, and disrupt supply chains vital to the defense of the Southern Front. Additionally, the Dnieper River provided both a natural defensive barrier for the Soviets and a key route for the Germans to exploit once crossings were secured. Army Group South aimed to dominate these strategic points, using them not only to facilitate the encirclement, but also to enable subsequent advances deeper into Ukraine. The fall of Kiev would thus have operational, logistical, and strategic repercussions far beyond the city itself. The human and psychological dimensions of the Kiev operation were equally significant. German planners understood that a rapid, overwhelming victory would have a demoralizing effect on Soviet troops, encouraging surrender and reducing resistance in surrounding regions. Conversely, a prolonged battle would allow the Red Army to regroup, reinforcing defensive positions and potentially complicating German plans. For Soviet commanders, maintaining cohesion and morale among exhausted, poorly equipped troops was paramount. Civilians in Kiev and nearby regions were also drawn into the conflict, contributing labor to fortifications, evacuating essential resources, and enduring the constant threat of bombardment and invasion. The interplay of military, logistical, and human factors created a complex environment in which every decision had far-reaching consequences. By mid-September, The German encirclement strategy was entering its final phase. The pincer movements from the north and south were approaching convergence, and Soviet forces found themselves increasingly constrained and vulnerable. Kirponos attempted to organize counterattacks and reposition units to slow the German advance, but the speed and coordination of the Wehrmacht left little room for maneuver. The Southwestern Front, despite the courage and resilience of its soldiers, was facing an existential threat. Hitler's determination to capture Kiev, combined with meticulous operational planning and the ruthless efficiency of the German army, set the stage for one of the largest encirclements in military history, a maneuver that would leave an indelible mark on the Eastern Front and the course of the Second World War. Chapter 5: Guderian and Kleist. The Pincer armies moved south. As the late summer of 1941 unfolded, two names became synonymous with the rapid and devastating advance of the German army into Ukraine: Heinz Guderian and Ewald von Kleist. These commanders were entrusted with the execution of a maneuver that would ultimately decide the fate of Kiev, the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front. Guderian, the architect of armored warfare in the Wehrmacht, commanded the 2nd Panzer Group, renowned for its speed, flexibility, and ability to exploit weaknesses in enemy lines. Kleist, a seasoned officer with extensive operational experience, led the 1st Panzer Group in the south, tasked with converging with Guderian's forces to close the trap. Their coordinated movement represented not just a tactical operation, but a grand demonstration of blitzkrieg principles on a scale rarely attempted in military history. The success of their advance would depend on precise timing, seamless communication, and relentless pressure, all executed over a vast and challenging terrain. From the moment they pivoted southward in early August, Guderian and Kleist faced immense operational challenges. The distances involved were staggering, requiring the movement of tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and countless support vehicles across hundreds of kilometers of road, field, and river crossings. Logistics was a constant concern. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be transported along fragile supply lines vulnerable to Soviet sabotage and partisan activity. Yet, Guderian's philosophy of aggressive maneuver and rapid exploitation dictated that speed take precedence over caution. Delays would allow the Red Army to reinforce positions, organize counterattacks, or escape the encirclement. Every kilometer advanced by the panzers brought the Germans closer to completing one of the most ambitious operational maneuvers of the campaign. Guderian's northern thrust was characterized by audacious boldness. His Panzer Corps moved rapidly through the Gomel and Chernihiv regions, bypassing fortified positions whenever possible and striking at weak points in the Soviet defenses. Reconnaissance units scouted enemy positions, relaying critical intelligence that allowed armored divisions to maneuver with precision. Infantry and artillery were kept in close support, consolidating gains, securing flanks, and ensuring that supply lines remained intact despite the rapid pace of advance. Guderian's approach was one of controlled chaos, a combination of speed, surprise, and relentless pressure designed to paralyze the enemy. Soviet forces, though courageous and numerous, were ill-prepared to respond to such a dynamic and fluid threat, especially given the rigid directives they had received from Moscow. Kleist's southern movement mirrored Guderian's in intensity and precision. Advancing northward from the Dnieper basin, his forces were tasked with closing the encirclement from the south, cutting off key retreat routes, and isolating Soviet formations. Kleist coordinated closely with infantry, artillery, and air support, ensuring that mechanized thrusts were reinforced and that the enemy could not break through at critical points. The southern terrain presented its own challenges: rivers, Marshes and dense forests created natural obstacles that slowed movement and complicated logistics. Nonetheless, Kleist's units pressed forward with determination, exploiting gaps in Soviet defenses and using speed as both a shield and a weapon. Coordination between Guderian and Kleist was paramount. Their convergence east of Kiev had to be timed perfectly to trap the Red Army, without allowing it to escape or counterattack. The psychological impact of these pincer movements on the Soviet forces was profound. Soldiers of the Southwestern Front, already exhausted from continuous retreats and engagements, faced the terrifying prospect of being surrounded by superior mechanized forces. Reports of German armored columns advancing from both north and south created confusion, panic, and disarray. Units attempted to reposition and regroup, but the sheer speed of the German advance often rendered such efforts futile. Commanders like Kirponos tried to organize counterattacks to slow the panzers, yet each engagement came at a cost, further weakening the ability of the Soviet forces to resist the encirclement. The pressure applied by Guderian and Kleist was not merely physical. It was a relentless psychological assault, designed to fracture cohesion and morale. The operational coordination required for this maneuver was staggering. Guderian and Kleist had to synchronize movements over hundreds of kilometers, manage the flow of supplies and reinforcements, and ensure continuous communication between units operating in a chaotic environment. Artillery and infantry had to protect flanks. Engineer units had to maintain river crossings and bridges, and the Luftwaffe had to dominate the skies to prevent Soviet countermeasures. Every element of the German war machine was integrated into a single, relentless drive, illustrating the full potential of combined arms operations. The effectiveness of this coordination would ultimately determine the success of the encirclement, making the skill and judgment of the two panzer leaders crucial to the outcome. As the German pincers closed in on Kiev, the Soviets began to realize the scale of the threat. Intelligence reports indicated massive armored formations converging from both directions, yet Stalin's orders still emphasized holding ground at all costs. Kirponos attempted to maneuver divisions to plug gaps, reinforce key positions, and delay the enemy's advance, but the rapid movement of German forces left little room for maneuver. Supply shortages, exhaustion, and constant enemy pressure compounded the difficulty of executing these plans. Despite heroic efforts, the Southwestern Front faced an increasingly desperate situation, with every passing day bringing the threat of encirclement closer to realization. In this context, the roles of Guderian and Kleist were not just operational, but symbolic. Their ability to execute the encirclement with precision demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of German armored warfare and the operational genius of blitzkrieg principles. They were pushing the limits of both logistics and command, maneuvering massive formations across difficult terrain while maintaining offensive momentum. The convergence of their pincer movements represented the culmination of months of planning and preparation, a high-stakes gamble that, if successful, would trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and secure a decisive victory in the south. The stakes could not have been higher, and the pressure on the German commanders matched the peril faced by their Soviet adversaries, whose lives and futures were now inextricably bound to the outcome of this grand maneuver. By early September 1941, Guderian's and Kleist's pincer movements had progressed deep into Ukrainian territory, bringing them ever closer to the converging point east of Kiev. The speed and coordination of their advance were staggering. Panzer divisions, moving at unprecedented rates, cut through open plains, bypassed heavily fortified Soviet positions, and struck at weak points in the defensive lines of the Southwestern Front. Infantry and artillery units followed in close support, consolidating gains, defending flanks, and ensuring that supply lines remained intact despite the rapid pace. The Luftwaffe maintained dominance of the skies, disrupting Soviet communications, attacking retreating columns, and providing reconnaissance to ensure that the panzer groups could maneuver effectively without being surprised by enemy reinforcements. The German operational machine was functioning at full capacity, a well-oiled instrument of war moving inexorably toward its objective. For the Soviet defenders, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Kirponos and his staff struggled to maintain cohesion among units spread across a vast and chaotic front. Communication lines were intermittently severed by German air raids, artillery bombardments, and the sheer mobility of the panzer columns. Attempts to reposition divisions, launch counterattacks, or reinforce vulnerable sectors were often frustrated by delays in orders, fuel shortages, or misinterpretation of Moscow's directives. Despite these challenges, Soviet soldiers fought with remarkable courage and determination, digging into positions, mounting localized counterattacks, and attempting to slow the German advance whenever possible. Every delay mattered, as it could allow reserves to arrive or create opportunities to extract portions of the trapped forces. Yet the scale and speed of the German maneuver increasingly made these efforts appear futile. The operational brilliance of Guderian and Kleist was evident in their ability to maintain momentum while coordinating over such a vast area. Guderian's northern thrust was carefully timed to keep pressure on Soviet forces, preventing them from consolidating or retreating to safer positions. Reconnaissance units continuously scouted enemy positions, identifying weak points and opportunities for rapid penetration. Artillery units targeted Soviet concentrations, and infantry ensured that gaps in the advancing lines were quickly filled. Kleist's southern advance mirrored this approach, with his armored divisions exploiting every gap in the Soviet defenses, moving through forests, marshes, and river crossings with a combination of audacity and precision. The convergence of these two forces was meticulously orchestrated, with the ultimate goal of encircling the Southwestern front in a pocket of unprecedented size. The psychological impact of this maneuver on the Soviet forces cannot be overstated. Reports of German armor advancing from both north and south created confusion, panic, and uncertainty. Soldiers faced the terrifying prospect of being surrounded, cut off from supplies, and trapped in a deadly cage. Commanders like Kirponos tried to orchestrate defensive measures, counterattacks, and withdrawals, but the speed and coordination of the German panzers often outpaced their best efforts. Morale, while bolstered by determination and loyalty, was constantly tested by the relentless pressure and the seemingly unstoppable advance of the enemy. Civilians in the path of the German army also experienced fear, displacement, and destruction, adding another layer of complexity to the defensive effort. The logistical challenges of the German advance were immense but masterfully managed. Fuel, ammunition, and provisions had to be transported across hundreds of kilometers, often through difficult terrain and under threat from partisan activity. Supply lines were protected by infantry and artillery units, while engineering teams maintained bridges, roads, and river crossings to keep the mechanized columns moving. The coordination required for such an operation was unprecedented, demanding constant communication and flexibility. Any breakdown in logistics could have slowed the advance, giving Soviet forces a chance to regroup. The German ability to overcome these challenges reflected both their preparation and their commitment to maintaining the offensive tempo that was crucial to the success of the encirclement. By mid-September, the Pincer movements were nearing completion. The northern and southern panzer groups were on the verge of linking east of Kiev, a convergence that would trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops within a massive pocket. Kirponos recognized the threat, attempting last-ditch countermeasures to prevent encirclement, but the scale of the German operation left him with few options. Soviet forces were exhausted, depleted, and facing shortages of essential supplies. Every delay in German coordination, however, was quickly corrected as armored divisions surged forward to close the gaps and solidify the encirclement. The pressure on the Southwestern Front was now absolute, and the fate of Kiev and the soldiers defending it hung in the balance. The impending encirclement demonstrated not only the operational genius of Guderian and Kleist, but also the lethal effectiveness of combined arms warfare. Panzer divisions, infantry, artillery, and the Luftwaffe functioned as a single, integrated machine, exploiting speed, surprise, and coordination to devastating effect. The ability to execute such a maneuver over hundreds of kilometers under challenging conditions highlighted the strategic and tactical sophistication of the German army. As the two Pincer armies moved inexorably closer to their convergence, the Southwestern Front faced a challenge unlike any other, one that would soon define the early months of Operation Barbarossa and leave an indelible mark on the Eastern Front. Chapter 6. The Encirclement begins. Early clashes and Soviet responses. By early September 1941, the German pincer movements under Guderian and Kleist had reached the critical phase of their advance, and the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front was beginning to take shape. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops, stretched across a front of several hundred kilometers, now faced the looming threat of complete entrapment. For General Kirponos and his staff, the gravity of the situation became increasingly apparent. Defensive positions, hastily prepared and often undermanned, were no longer sufficient to slow the German onslaught. Soviet units found themselves increasingly isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and subjected to relentless attacks by mechanized forces that seemed capable of appearing anywhere along the front at will. The early clashes that marked the beginning of the encirclement would set the tone for the tragic events to follow, highlighting both the courage of Soviet troops and the operational mastery of the German forces. The first signs of the encirclement were evident in skirmishes along key river crossings and rail junctions. German reconnaissance units scouted Soviet positions, identifying weak points and flanking opportunities. Panzer divisions struck with devastating efficiency, bypassing fortified areas when possible and targeting command posts, supply depots, and communication centers. Infantry and artillery followed closely, consolidating gains and ensuring that gaps were rapidly filled. The Luftwaffe's air support compounded Soviet difficulties, bombing defensive positions, interdicting supply lines, and providing real-time intelligence to German commanders. Soviet troops, though determined, were frequently overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of these combined arms operations, forcing them into hurried withdrawals or desperate counterattacks that could not significantly alter the course of the battle. Soviet responses during this early phase of encirclement were characterized by improvisation and heroism. Units attempted to form blocking positions at key crossroads, use natural terrain to slow enemy armor, and mount counterattacks wherever possible. Infantrymen dug into fields, forests, and urban areas, creating defensive positions with whatever resources were available. Artillery batteries fired relentlessly, often under intense bombardment, in an attempt to disrupt German advances. Tank crews, facing numerically and technologically superior forces, conducted daring maneuvers to delay the enemy. Yet, despite these valiant efforts, the structural weaknesses of the Southwestern Front were becoming increasingly apparent. Poor communication, logistical shortages, and conflicting directives from Moscow limited the effectiveness of Soviet resistance, leaving large gaps in the lines that the Germans exploited with ruthless efficiency. One of the critical aspects of the early clashes was the psychological strain imposed on Soviet commanders and soldiers. Reports of German armored columns advancing from both north and south created confusion and fear. Units found themselves isolated, cut off from their neighbors, and under constant threat of encirclement. Kirponos, acutely aware of the danger, attempted to coordinate counterattacks and reposition forces to slow the German advance, but the mobility and coordination of the Wehrmacht made these efforts extremely difficult. The pressure on Soviet troops was immense. They faced exhaustion, shortage of supplies, and relentless enemy attacks, all while attempting to maintain cohesion and morale. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, contributed to the chaos, as evacuations, destruction of infrastructure, and flight from advancing forces disrupted both military and social stability in the region. The German operational plan relied on precise timing and coordination to ensure the success of the encirclement. Guderian's northern thrust and Kleist's southern advance were synchronized to converge east of Kiev, sealing the trap with minimal gaps. Infantry and artillery were tasked with consolidating positions, defending captured territory, and preventing Soviet units from escaping or reorganizing. The Luftwaffe's air superiority provided reconnaissance, interdiction, and close combat support, creating a multi-dimensional pressure on the Red Army. The combination of speed, maneuverability, and integrated operations allowed the Germans to outpace Soviet attempts at resistance, creating conditions in which the encirclement could be executed on a scale rarely seen in modern warfare. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Soviet forces did not succumb easily. Localized counterattacks, conducted by desperate infantry and tank units, temporarily delayed German advances and inflicted casualties on the attacking forces. Defensive positions along rivers, forests, and urban centers provided pockets of resistance, allowing some units to regroup and attempt withdrawal. These actions, though ultimately insufficient to prevent the encirclement, demonstrated the determination and resilience of the Soviet soldiers, who fought under conditions of extreme adversity. The early clashes thus became a testament to both the skill and bravery of the Red Army and the operational effectiveness of the German blitzkrieg tactics. As the days passed, the convergence of Guderian's and Kleist's forces became increasingly apparent to Soviet commanders. The threat of complete encirclement was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. Kirponos faced the unenviable task of coordinating a defense under conditions of extreme uncertainty, with communications intermittently severed, units under strength or cut off, and the enemy advancing with relentless precision. The early clashes of the encirclement phase highlighted the tactical ingenuity and boldness of the German commanders, as well as the courage and improvisation of Soviet forces attempting to resist against overwhelming odds. The battle for Kiev was entering its most critical stage, setting the scene for one of the largest and most consequential encirclements of the Second World War. As the first days of September 1941 unfolded, the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front around Kiev began to tighten, transforming into a deadly cage from which escape seemed increasingly impossible. The early clashes had already demonstrated the effectiveness of the German strategy, combining rapid armored thrusts with air superiority and coordinated infantry support. Soviet units, despite their determination, were being systematically forced into defensive positions that allowed little room for maneuver. Kirponos and his staff were acutely aware that the window to avert disaster was closing, Yet the rigidity of orders from Moscow complicated any attempt at strategic withdrawal. Every hour brought the German pincers closer, and the pressure on the Red Army intensified as the operational tempo of the Wehrmacht reached its peak. German reconnaissance and intelligence played a critical role in these early stages of encirclement. Recon units identified gaps in Soviet lines, weakly defended sectors, and the movement patterns of troops attempting to reposition. This intelligence allowed Guderian and Kleist to direct their armored divisions with precision, avoiding fortified positions when possible and striking at the most vulnerable points. Simultaneously, Luftwaffe aircraft bombed bridges, rail lines, and supply depots, further disrupting Soviet communications and logistics. The combined arms approach ensured that Soviet units were consistently reacting to German maneuvers rather than acting on their own initiative. Each skirmish, each withdrawal, and each counterattack was calculated by the Germans to channel Red Army forces toward the encirclement, tightening the trap with ruthless efficiency. Soviet resistance, though increasingly strained, continued to be formidable in localized engagements. Infantry units created makeshift defensive lines in forests, along riverbanks, and in small towns, using terrain to their advantage. Artillery batteries fired continuously to disrupt German armored thrusts, and tank crews undertook daring counterattacks to slow the advance. These actions, while heroic, were insufficient to change the strategic reality. Supply shortages, fractured communication lines, and exhaustion limited the effectiveness of these defensive efforts. Soldiers often fought with inadequate ammunition, food, and medical support, yet their determination bought critical time, delaying German progress and demonstrating the resilience and courage that would become a hallmark of the Red Army throughout the war. The operational coordination of the German pincer movement was becoming increasingly apparent as the encirclement tightened. Guderian's northern forces pressed southward with precision, exploiting every opportunity to bypass Soviet positions and isolate defensive units. Kleist's southern advance moved northward with similar effectiveness, capturing key rail hubs and river crossings that the Soviets had attempted to defend. Infantry and artillery units followed in support, consolidating gains and preventing breakout attempts. The Luftwaffe maintained control of the skies, bombing concentrated Soviet forces and interdicted movement along critical supply routes. This combination of speed, mobility, and integrated operations created a situation in which the Soviet Southwestern Front was increasingly constrained, forced to react under pressure rather than shape the battle on its own terms. The human toll of these early clashes was immense. Soldiers faced continuous engagement, limited rest, and shortages of essential supplies. Morale, while sustained by duty and loyalty, was constantly tested by the relentless pace of the German advance. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline and coordination as units became increasingly isolated, facing encirclement and the threat of annihilation. Civilians in the region were caught in the crossfire, fleeing towns and cities under bombardment and advancing armies, further complicating logistics and communications. The combination of physical, psychological, and environmental pressures created a scenario of extreme adversity, testing both the resilience of the Red Army and the endurance of the population supporting it. Strategically, the early encirclement clashes revealed the vulnerability of the Southwestern Front to rapid mechanized maneuvers. The Soviet command structure, though vast, was hampered by rigid directives from Moscow, communication breakdowns, and insufficient reserves to counter the concentrated attacks of the German panzer groups. Kirponos attempted to coordinate counterattacks and reposition forces to close gaps, but the mobility and firepower of the German units often rendered these efforts ineffective. The Germans exploited every lapse in coordination, every logistical weakness, and every delay in command to advance their encirclement, moving closer to what would become one of the largest pockets of trapped troops in the war. By mid-September, the initial phase of the encirclement had effectively channeled Soviet forces toward the destined pocket east of Kiev. Small-scale engagements, ambushes, and counterattacks slowed the Germans but could not prevent the gradual closure of the trap. Guderian and Kleist's coordination, combined with the supporting elements of artillery, infantry, and air power, ensured that the encirclement proceeded as planned. The Soviets, though fighting valiantly, faced the stark reality of a massive strategic maneuver executed with precision and speed. The early clashes thus not only demonstrated the operational brilliance of the German commanders, but also set the stage for the dramatic and tragic culmination of the Battle of Kiev, highlighting both the heroism of the defenders and the devastating effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics on the Eastern Front. Chapter 7: Soviet Command Dilemmas and Strategic Miscalculations. As the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front around Kiev tightened in September 1941, the failures and dilemmas of Soviet command became increasingly pronounced. The Red Army, despite its vast numerical strength, was hindered by conflicting orders, communication breakdowns, and the challenges of coordinating an army stretched across hundreds of kilometers of front. General Mikhail Kirponos, the commander of the Southwestern Front, found himself in a situation that demanded both audacity and prudence. Yet, every decision he faced was constrained by directives from Moscow that emphasized holding positions at all costs. The tension between strategic obedience and battlefield realities created critical vulnerabilities, leaving Soviet units struggling to maintain cohesion, morale, and effective resistance against an enemy that was moving with unprecedented speed and precision. The dilemmas facing the Soviet high command were multifaceted. Stalin's insistence on retaining Kiev was rooted not only in military considerations, but also in political and symbolic calculations. Losing the city would represent a psychological blow, undermining confidence in the Red Army and potentially affecting civilian morale across the southwestern regions of the USSR. At the same time, Moscow demanded that the Southwestern Front continue to resist and protect the city, limiting Kirponos's flexibility to maneuver troops or implement tactical withdrawals. The result was a paradoxical situation. Soviet forces were expected to hold an increasingly untenable position while simultaneously attempting to respond to rapidly shifting German threats, which included mechanized pincer movements and relentless Luftwaffe assaults. This created an environment of confusion, stress, and operational paralysis that German commanders would exploit to devastating effect. Communication challenges exacerbated the situation. In the chaos of continuous combat, orders from Moscow were frequently delayed, misinterpreted, or impossible to execute. Radio and telephone lines were disrupted by bombing, sabotage, and the physical movement of forces, isolating units from higher command and from each other. Messages often arrived too late to be actionable, and by the time commanders attempted to implement strategies, German units had already shifted the battlefield dynamics. This breakdown in communication forced field commanders to make rapid decisions with incomplete information, increasing the likelihood of errors and missed opportunities. The Soviet system, designed to maintain centralized control, proved ill-suited to the fluid, high-speed operations of the German blitzkrieg. Another critical factor in the command dilemmas was the distribution of forces. The Southwestern Front encompassed a vast area, with Soviet divisions stretched thinly across hundreds of kilometers. While individual units could mount determined resistance, their dispersion made coordinated defense difficult. Reinforcements, reserves, and counterattack units were either delayed or committed to sectors where they could not achieve decisive results. Attempts to plug gaps or respond to breakthroughs often failed because neighboring units were too distant to provide immediate support. German reconnaissance and intelligence allowed the panzers to identify these weak points, exploit them, and further isolate Soviet formations. The strategic misallocation of forces, combined with the rigid insistence on holding positions, created vulnerabilities that would prove disastrous as the encirclement progressed. The early days of September highlighted the tension between initiative and obedience within the Soviet command structure. Field commanders recognized the danger of German encirclement and the potential need to conduct tactical withdrawals to preserve forces. However, any deviation from orders risked disciplinary action or accusations of insubordination. Kirponos, acutely aware of these pressures, attempted to balance compliance with Moscow's directives against the tactical necessity of repositioning units to slow or disrupt the German advance. This delicate balancing act consumed significant command energy and contributed to delays in executing countermeasures that might have mitigated the impact of the pincer movements. The resulting indecision and fragmented responses allowed German forces to maintain operational momentum and tighten the encirclement with increasing efficiency. Logistical constraints further compounded command difficulties. The Southwestern Front was heavily dependent on extended supply lines for food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. German air superiority and rapid armored advances repeatedly disrupted these lines, leaving units vulnerable to attrition and operational collapse. Resupply convoys were often delayed or destroyed, while stockpiles of essential resources became increasingly scarce. Commanders were forced to make difficult choices about where to allocate limited supplies, which units to reinforce, and which sectors to abandon or hold at reduced strength. Each decision carried significant consequences, impacting both the effectiveness of defensive operations and the survival of the troops involved. In addition to material and operational challenges, Soviet commanders faced profound psychological pressures. Soldiers were under constant stress, facing relentless enemy attacks and the threat of encirclement. The morale of troops could not be taken for granted. It required careful management, reassurance, and leadership from officers under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Kirponos and his staff had to maintain discipline, encourage determination, and prevent panic, all while dealing with incomplete information and rapidly deteriorating tactical conditions. Civilians, too, added complexity as they attempted to evacuate, support defensive works, or simply survive in an increasingly dangerous environment. These human factors weighed heavily on Soviet command decisions, influencing both the timing and execution of maneuvers. Despite these challenges, Soviet forces demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of operational dilemmas. Infantry, artillery, and armored units fought bravely, mounting delaying actions, counterattacks, and defensive stands that slowed the German advance and inflicted casualties. While these efforts could not ultimately prevent encirclement, they reflected the determination and skill of the Red Army under extraordinarily adverse circumstances. The tension between strategic obedience, battlefield reality, and the imperative to resist created a complex and tragic dynamic, setting the stage for one of the most catastrophic encirclements of the Second World War. As September progressed, the consequences of Soviet command dilemmas and miscalculations around Kiev became increasingly evident. The Southwestern Front, despite its numerical superiority in some sectors, was gradually being funneled into the tightening traps set by the German pincer movements. Kirponos and his staff faced mounting pressure as each misstep or delayed decision widened the gaps through which Guderian's and Kleist's forces advanced. The rigidity of orders from Moscow, combined with fractured communications and logistical difficulties, prevented a flexible response capable of exploiting fleeting opportunities or repositioning units to reinforce threatened sectors. The resulting situation reflected a broader pattern of Soviet command challenges in the early months of Operation Barbarossa, where strategic imperatives from the center often conflicted with the tactical realities on the ground. The Soviet High Command's insistence on holding Kiev at all costs created a paradoxical scenario. On one hand, the city's retention was intended to preserve strategic depth and maintain control over southwestern Ukraine. On the other, the encirclement threat meant that holding positions could lead to catastrophic losses. Kirponos understood that withdrawing some formations to establish secondary defensive lines might save large portions of the army, yet any attempt at retreat risked disobedience charges and political repercussions. This tension between obedience and operational necessity paralyzed many decisions, slowing responses to German breakthroughs and giving the Wehrmacht the initiative. The inflexibility imposed by Stalin's directives contributed directly to the inability of the Southwestern Front to adapt dynamically, highlighting how political considerations could influence military outcomes with devastating consequences. One of the key miscalculations involved the allocation and concentration of forces. The Southwestern Front was vast, encompassing multiple armies and numerous divisions, yet the distribution of units did not match the intensity or direction of the German assault. Some sectors were heavily defended while others, particularly in areas threatened by rapid panzer advances, were thinly held or inadequately supplied. This uneven distribution allowed German commanders to exploit weak points, encircle units, and prevent coordinated counterattacks. Attempts to redeploy troops to plug gaps were often delayed by communication breakdowns or logistical constraints, making reinforcements arrive too late to influence critical engagements. These miscalculations reflected both the challenges of commanding a sprawling front and the limitations of a rigid, top-down command structure in responding to fast-moving mechanized warfare. Logistics and supply presented another critical challenge for the Soviet command. Armies in the field depended on extended rail and road networks for ammunition, fuel, and food. Yet German air raids and rapid advances disrupted these lifelines. Supply shortages limited operational flexibility, forcing commanders to ration resources, prioritize certain units, or abandon positions that could not be sustained. The pressure of maintaining operational readiness under such constraints compounded decision-making challenges and reduced the effectiveness of defensive maneuvers. Units often faced the dual threat of enemy assault and starvation or lack of ammunition, weakening morale and increasing vulnerability to encirclement. Compounding the operational and logistical challenges was the psychological strain on Soviet commanders and troops. Soldiers were constantly exposed to the threat of encirclement, relentless artillery and air bombardments, and the uncertainty of whether reinforcements would arrive. Commanders were tasked with maintaining cohesion, discipline, and morale under extreme stress, often while contending with incomplete or contradictory information. Panic and disarray became increasingly likely as units were isolated or faced overwhelming German forces. Civilians fleeing the advancing front lines added to the chaos, creating additional logistical and moral dilemmas for commanders attempting to maintain order in an environment of growing desperation. Efforts to mount counterattacks, while occasionally successful in delaying German progress, were hampered by coordination failures and resource shortages. Soviet tank brigades and infantry units launched attacks intended to disrupt armored thrusts, slow supply movements, or protect retreating forces, yet these efforts were piecemeal and lacked the concentration necessary for strategic effect. German reconnaissance quickly identified these movements, and air and artillery strikes often neutralized them before they could achieve significant impact. The inability to concentrate forces effectively reflected both the dispersed nature of the Southwestern Front and the rigid expectations placed on field commanders, leaving Soviet forces unable to respond decisively to the encirclement as the days passed. It became increasingly clear that Soviet strategic miscalculations were compounding the physical threat posed by the German Pincer. Orders to hold positions, coupled with communication delays, resource shortages, and uneven force distribution, created a situation in which large portions of the army were gradually being trapped. Korponos faced the impossible task of balancing obedience to Moscow's directives with the operational reality that flexibility and tactical withdrawal were necessary for survival. These dilemmas, combined with the relentless efficiency of the German forces, set the stage for the catastrophic encirclement that would soon engulf the Southwestern Front, marking one of the most decisive and tragic episodes of the Battle of Kiev. The early stages of the encirclement and the missteps of the Soviet command highlighted a fundamental lesson of the Eastern Front: rigidity, miscommunication, and over-centralization in the face of a mobile, mechanized enemy could turn numerical strength into vulnerability. Despite the bravery, resourcefulness, and determination of individual Soviet units and commanders, the structural limitations of the command system prevented an effective response. The tightening German encirclement, coupled with these strategic miscalculations, ensured that the Southwestern Front would soon face a situation from which few could escape, underscoring the deadly consequences of command dilemmas in modern mechanized warfare. Chapter 8: German Tactical Mastery and the Role of Blitzkrieg. By mid-September 1941, as the Soviet Southwestern Front struggled to respond effectively, the operational brilliance of the German forces became increasingly apparent. The Battle of Kiev had evolved into a showcase of blitzkrieg tactics executed on a massive scale. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was more than a military doctrine. It was a philosophy of movement, coordination, and speed designed to paralyze an enemy before it could react. In the Kiev campaign, the Wehrmacht applied these principles with devastating effect. Tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and aircraft operated as a cohesive, integrated system, each element reinforcing the others to achieve operational goals that no single arm could accomplish alone. The result was a swift, overwhelming pressure that left Soviet commanders scrambling to mount a coherent defense. The mechanized spearhead, led by Guderian in the north and Kleist in the south, epitomized the power of blitzkrieg. These armored formations advanced rapidly, bypassing heavily fortified positions when feasible and striking deep into enemy territory. Reconnaissance units scouted ahead, identifying weak points, enemy concentrations, and suitable terrain for armored movement. Panzer divisions exploited these opportunities, creating pockets of disorganization within Soviet lines and forcing troops into reactive, rather than proactive, stances. Infantry followed, consolidating gains, securing flanks, and protecting supply lines, ensuring that the armored thrust could maintain momentum. Artillery units provided continuous fire support, suppressing Soviet resistance and disrupting counterattacks. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, conducting reconnaissance, interdiction, and close air support to amplify the effects of the ground advance. The coordination between these elements was seamless, turning what could have been a chaotic maneuver into a precise operational strike. The genius of Blitzkrieg in the Kiev campaign lay not only in speed, but in the psychological impact it had on the enemy. Soviet units, already fatigued from weeks of retreat and rearguard actions, faced the terrifying prospect of being enveloped by enemy armor that seemed to appear from multiple directions simultaneously. The rapid German advances created confusion, eroded morale, and disrupted command and control. Units attempting to regroup or establish defensive positions found themselves surrounded, attacked from the rear, or cut off from supplies. The psychological shock of facing a coordinated, multi-directional assault magnified the physical effects of the Blitzkrieg, making even well-trained and numerically superior forces vulnerable to collapse under pressure. A critical component of the German operational success was the use of combined arms doctrine to create synergy among different military branches. Tanks were not deployed in isolation, but in coordination with infantry, artillery, and air support. Mechanized infantry could exploit breakthroughs, holding captured terrain and protecting armored flanks, while artillery suppressed enemy strongpoints and disrupted formations attempting to reorganize. Close air support neutralized key defensive positions and cut supply lines, amplifying the destructive power of the ground assault. This integration allowed the Germans to maintain relentless pressure across a broad front, preventing Soviet commanders from stabilizing the situation or launching effective countermeasures. Each German element reinforced the others, creating a force multiplier effect that amplified both tactical and operational outcomes. The speed and maneuverability of the panzer groups played a decisive role in achieving the encirclement. Guderian's northern advance cut through open terrain, bypassing strongpoints and isolating Soviet units. Kleist's southern thrust moved in coordination to close the trap east of Kiev, severing retreat routes and creating the conditions for a massive encirclement. The synchronization of these movements required precise timing and coordination, which was achieved through rigorous planning, real-time reconnaissance, and flexible command structures. The German ability to maintain operational tempo despite the complexity of the maneuver demonstrated not only technical proficiency, but also doctrinal innovation, allowing them to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities to the fullest extent. The effectiveness of Blitzkrieg was further amplified by German operational discipline and initiative. Unit commanders were empowered to make rapid decisions within the framework of broader strategic objectives, allowing armored columns and mechanized formations to exploit fleeting opportunities without waiting for centralized approval. This decentralized decision-making, combined with strict adherence to operational plans, ensured that momentum was maintained and opportunities were seized immediately. Soviet forces, by contrast, were constrained by centralized command directives that limited flexibility and delayed responses, creating an operational asymmetry that the Germans exploited with devastating effect. Logistics, often the Achilles heel of rapid operations, was carefully managed to sustain the Blitzkrieg tempo. Supply units, protected by infantry and supported by engineers, maintained fuel, ammunition, and provisions for the advancing forces. Bridge-building teams, road repair units, and rail transport facilitated rapid movement across rivers and damaged infrastructure, ensuring that armored and infantry units could continue their advance without interruption. This attention to logistical detail enabled the German forces to maintain operational continuity, preventing the slowdown that might have allowed Soviet forces to reorganize or escape the encirclement. By mid-September, it was evident that German tactical mastery and blitzkrieg principles were overwhelming Soviet defenses. The encirclement was nearing completion, with Soviet units increasingly constrained and facing imminent annihilation or surrender. The Battle of Kiev thus became a defining demonstration of the power of coordinated, mechanized warfare, illustrating how speed, precision, and integration could achieve decisive operational outcomes even against a numerically formidable opponent. The early phases of this encirclement highlighted not only the technical and doctrinal innovations of the Wehrmacht, but also the vulnerabilities inherent in rigid, centralized command structures facing a dynamic and adaptive enemy. As September 1941 progressed, the full effects of German tactical mastery and the Blitzkrieg doctrine became unmistakable on the Kiev front. The convergence of Guderian's and Kleist's armored thrusts was approaching a critical juncture, with hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops increasingly trapped within a tightening pocket. Blitzkrieg's effectiveness was not simply a product of rapid movement. It was a carefully orchestrated combination of speed, coordination, psychological pressure, and logistical planning that left the enemy struggling to respond. German commanders had learned from previous campaigns that success required not only tactical skill, but also an understanding of how to manipulate the battlefield environment to maximize the psychological and operational impact on their opponent. Every maneuver, every engagement, and every artillery strike was part of an intricate plan designed to paralyze the Red Army before it could mount an effective defense. The role of armored units remained central to the German approach. Panzer divisions, operating with both mobility and firepower, struck deep into Soviet lines, bypassing heavily fortified positions and exploiting weak sectors. Reconnaissance units scouted ahead, ensuring that tanks and mechanized infantry moved into positions where they could achieve maximum effect. The armored columns were supported by mechanized infantry, which secured flanks, held captured territory, and prevented counterattacks from compromising momentum. Artillery provided continuous suppression of enemy strongpoints, while Luftwaffe aircraft maintained air superiority, disrupting Soviet communications, bombing supply routes, and assisting ground troops in real time. The combined effect was a relentless pressure on the Red Army that made coherent defensive planning almost impossible. One of the most striking features of the German operation was the psychological impact of Blitzkrieg on Soviet forces. Soldiers, already fatigued from weeks of retreat and continuous engagement, faced the terrifying prospect of being encircled by armored formations capable of striking from multiple directions simultaneously. Units that attempted to regroup or establish defensive positions were frequently cut off or attacked from the rear. Panic, confusion, and disorganization spread as communications faltered and command structures were disrupted. Soviet troops, though brave and determined, found themselves reacting to events rather than shaping them, a situation exacerbated by the speed and flexibility of German maneuvers. The psychological dimension of Blitzkrieg magnified the physical effects, creating conditions in which even determined resistance could be overcome by operational brilliance. Operational coordination between different arms of the German military was critical to sustaining the Blitzkrieg effect. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft were not employed independently, but as a single, integrated system. Tanks created breakthroughs. Mechanized infantry secured gains. Artillery suppressed defensive positions, and aircraft provided reconnaissance and direct support. This synergy allowed the Germans to maintain pressure across a broad front, prevent Soviet forces from reorganizing, and exploit weaknesses wherever they appeared. The seamless integration of these elements reflected doctrinal innovation and operational discipline, allowing the Wehrmacht to achieve results far greater than the sum of its parts. The German command structure was also designed to facilitate initiative within a clear strategic framework. Unit commanders were empowered to make rapid decisions on the battlefield, adjusting maneuvers to exploit emerging opportunities. This decentralized approach, coupled with strict adherence to operational objectives, ensured that momentum was maintained even as conditions shifted. In contrast, Soviet commanders were constrained by centralized directives from Moscow, often delayed, contradictory, or impractical under battlefield conditions. The resulting asymmetry allowed German forces to dictate the pace and nature of combat, leaving Soviet troops constantly on the defensive and increasingly confined within the encirclement. Logistics played a crucial role in sustaining blitzkrieg operations. German supply units, supported by engineers, ensured that armored and infantry divisions had sufficient fuel, ammunition, and provisions to maintain their advance. Bridges were repaired or constructed, roads cleared, and supply lines protected against sabotage, allowing for continuous operational tempo. The careful management of logistics meant that the Germans could sustain offensive momentum even over long distances, preventing delays that could have allowed Soviet forces to escape or regroup. The synchronization of combat operations with logistical support exemplified the holistic planning that made blitzkrieg particularly effective during the Kiev campaign. By mid-September, the German encirclement was nearing completion. Soviet units, despite heroic efforts to resist, were increasingly constrained, cut off, and demoralized. Attempts to break out or launch counterattacks were met with overwhelming firepower and tactical coordination. The success of blitzkrieg in the Kiev campaign demonstrated the lethal potential of integrated, fast-moving, and psychologically calibrated operations. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of an enemy constrained by rigid command structures, fragmented communications, and dispersed forces. The combination of speed, coordination, psychological pressure, and logistical management allowed the Wehrmacht to achieve operational objectives with devastating efficiency, setting the stage for one of the largest encirclements in military history. The German application of blitzkrieg at Kiev was a defining moment in the Second World War. It showcased not only technical and tactical prowess, but also an understanding of operational art, the ability to link individual battles to strategic goals. The convergence of armored columns, coordinated artillery, infantry support, and air superiority created a multidimensional threat that the Soviet Southwestern Front struggled to counter. The effectiveness of blitzkrieg, combined with the vulnerabilities inherent in Soviet command and logistics, ensured that the encirclement would succeed. The lessons from Kiev would resonate throughout the Eastern Front, illustrating both the strengths of mechanized warfare and the catastrophic consequences of strategic miscalculations under pressure. Chapter 9. The Soviet Southwestern Front under siege. By late September 1941, the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front around Kiev had become increasingly perilous. The German Pincer movements led by Guderian in the north and Kleist in the south were approaching their intended convergence, leaving hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops increasingly trapped in a tightening noose. The Southwestern Front, one of the largest and most strategically significant formations in the Red Army, was now facing the full force of a meticulously executed operational plan. The combination of rapid armored thrusts, coordinated infantry support, artillery bombardment, and Luftwaffe air dominance created a multifaceted pressure that the Soviets struggled to counter. Commanders at every level were forced to contend with fragmented communications, dwindling supplies, and the psychological weight of imminent encirclement, testing the limits of human endurance and tactical ingenuity. the frontline units found themselves under relentless assault. German panzer divisions, moving at astonishing speed, struck repeatedly at weak points in the Soviet lines, bypassing strong positions and isolating entire divisions. Mechanized infantry followed closely, securing territory, protecting armored flanks, and preventing Soviet units from regrouping. Artillery continuously targeted defensive positions, command centers, and supply depots, further eroding the ability of Soviet troops to resist. The Luftwaffe's air attacks disrupted reinforcements, destroyed transportation networks, and inflicted heavy casualties on both troops and equipment. The combined effect was a continuous operational pressure that left little opportunity for effective planning or countermeasures. Every Soviet division that attempted to hold ground was either forced to retreat under fire or became increasingly vulnerable to encirclement. The human experience of the siege was harrowing. Soldiers faced constant bombardment, limited supplies, and the fear of being trapped by German forces. Commanders like Kirponos were acutely aware of the mounting danger, but faced the impossible task of maintaining discipline and cohesion in units under extreme stress. Communication lines were frequently severed by air attacks and artillery fire, leaving frontline units isolated and commanders unable to issue timely orders. Civilians in the path of the German advance were forced to flee, often into areas already devastated by the fighting, creating additional logistical and moral challenges. The combination of operational, psychological, and environmental pressures created a situation in which survival depended as much on individual resourcefulness and courage as on formal command structures or strategic planning. Despite these challenges, Soviet forces continued to fight tenaciously. Localized counterattacks, particularly by tank brigades and artillery units, temporarily disrupted German advances and inflicted losses on armored columns. Infantry units established defensive positions in forests, urban areas, and along riverbanks, using terrain to compensate for the disadvantages imposed by the speed and coordination of German forces. These delaying actions were critical in buying time for other units to retreat, reorganize, or attempt to escape encirclement. Nevertheless, the structural weaknesses of the Southwestern Front, fragmented lines, logistical shortages, and rigid command directives, limited the overall effectiveness of these efforts. The Germans exploited gaps wherever they appeared, methodically tightening the encirclement and making breakout attempts increasingly desperate. Strategically, the encirclement placed the Southwestern Front in a situation of extreme operational stress. Soviet commanders were forced to make difficult decisions regarding resource allocation, troop movements, and defensive priorities. Supplies were scarce and unevenly distributed, forcing units to ration food, ammunition, and fuel. Attempts to reinforce critical sectors often failed due to communication delays, logistical breakdowns, or the rapid movement of German forces. The centralization of command, while intended to maintain control, paradoxically slowed decision-making and prevented the flexible responses necessary in a fluid battlefield. As a result, even well-planned defensive operations were frequently rendered ineffective before they could be executed. The psychological dimension of the siege cannot be overstated. The constant threat of encirclement, combined with relentless bombardment and the apparent omnipresence of German armored columns, created a pervasive sense of urgency and fear among Soviet troops. Commanders attempted to maintain morale through personal leadership, inspirational orders, and tactical successes, but the scale and intensity of the German operation tested even the most disciplined units. Panic and disorganization threatened to undermine efforts to hold positions, and the pressure on both military personnel and civilian populations contributed to a chaotic environment in which every day brought new challenges and dangers. The role of terrain during the siege was also significant. The Southwestern Front extended over rivers, forests, and urban areas, each offering potential defensive advantages but also complicating coordination. German forces skillfully exploited gaps in the terrain, using armored units to bypass obstacles, while infantry and artillery secured critical points. Soviet troops attempted to use rivers, forests, and built-up areas to slow the German advance, create choke points, and establish defensive strongholds. Yet the speed and coordination of the Wehrmacht often rendered these measures only partially effective. Terrain, while a potential ally, became a complex factor in a battle defined by mobility, coordination, and psychological pressure. As the encirclement tightened, the operational stress on the Southwestern Front reached critical levels. Soviet units increasingly faced isolation, supply shortages, and relentless German pressure. Attempts to regroup or counterattack were often thwarted by the combination of speed, coordination, and firepower deployed by the Wehrmacht. The siege around Kiev demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of mechanized, integrated operations and highlighted the challenges faced by a command structure ill-equipped to respond dynamically to rapid, multidimensional threats. The resilience of Soviet troops, while remarkable, could not overcome the structural and operational disadvantages that now defined the battle. The Southwestern Front was on the brink, with every passing day bringing the Germans closer to completing one of the largest and most consequential encirclements in military history. By late September 1941, the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front around Kiev had progressed to a stage of near inevitability. German panzer groups, coordinated with mechanized infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe support, were closing the gap east of the city, turning the surrounding area into an ever-tightening trap. Soviet forces, despite numerical strength in some sectors, found themselves stretched, isolated, and increasingly incapable of mounting a coherent defense. Commanders struggled to coordinate retreats or defensive maneuvers, hindered by severed communications, logistical bottlenecks, and contradictory orders from Moscow, demanding both the defense of Kiev and operational discipline under extreme duress. Each passing day intensified the pressure on frontline units, with survival and strategic outcomes hanging in a delicate balance between courage, improvisation, and operational realities. The encirclement's operational mechanics were both precise and relentless. Guderian's northern forces had systematically bypassed fortified positions, moving swiftly across the open plains to cut Soviet retreat routes, while Kleist's southern thrust advanced through forests, towns, and river crossings to seal the southern perimeter. Reconnaissance units, artillery, and infantry acted in unison to identify and exploit gaps, while the Luftwaffe continuously attacked critical supply lines, troop concentrations, and defensive strongpoints. The integration of these elements created a multidimensional threat. Tanks and mechanized infantry threatened mobility, artillery destroyed defensive positions, and aircraft created both physical and psychological disruption. Soviet commanders faced a daunting reality. Any attempt at maneuver could be immediately countered or rendered irrelevant by rapid German adaptation. Soviet troops, aware of the growing danger, displayed extraordinary tenacity. Infantry units dug into the earth, utilizing natural terrain and urban structures to slow enemy advances. Tank brigades launched localized counterattacks, attempting to disrupt panzer thrusts and reopen potential escape routes. Artillery units, often under heavy fire and with depleted supplies, provided covering fire to allow retreating units to reorganize or attempt breakout maneuvers. Civilians caught in the crossfire exacerbated logistical and operational challenges, as towns emptied of residents disrupted supply transport, and roads clogged with fleeing population slowed movement. Despite these valiant efforts, the structural weaknesses of the Southwestern Front, fragmented lines, depleted reserves, and centralized command rigidity, limited the effectiveness of Soviet resistance and increased vulnerability to encirclement. The psychological toll on Soviet troops and commanders was immense. Reports of German forces advancing from multiple directions created confusion and panic. Troops faced the constant fear of entrapment, while units attempting to withdraw or regroup often discovered that escape routes were already compromised. Commanders were forced to make rapid, high-stakes decisions with incomplete information, balancing the need to maintain morale against the operational necessity of tactical withdrawal. In many cases, indecision or delayed action resulted in units being caught between converging German forces, further weakening defensive cohesion. The mental strain on soldiers and officers alike contributed to disorganization and hampered effective resistance, demonstrating how operational psychology could influence the outcome of a battle as much as weaponry or numbers. Logistical challenges continued to compound the Southwestern Front's predicament. Ammunition, fuel, and food were in short supply, with German attacks on supply depots, rail lines, and road networks preventing adequate resupply. Units were forced to ration resources, leaving them increasingly vulnerable to sustained assaults. Attempts to reinforce critical sectors often failed due to delayed or misdirected orders, poor communication, and the rapid mobility of German forces. Even well-equipped divisions found themselves unable to hold positions when facing a coordinated attack by armor, infantry, artillery, and air power. These logistical difficulties amplified the operational challenges of encirclement, making coordinated defensive action increasingly improbable and forcing commanders into reactive, rather than proactive, strategies. The interplay between terrain, mobility, and German operational flexibility became increasingly decisive. While Soviet forces attempted to use rivers, forests, and towns to create defensive choke points, German units skillfully bypassed these obstacles, exploiting gaps and advancing with remarkable coordination. Armored columns maneuvered to cut off retreat paths, mechanized infantry secured key positions, and artillery targeted choke points to prevent Soviet regrouping. The cumulative effect was the gradual compression of Soviet forces into an increasingly confined area, where resistance, no matter how determined, became progressively unsustainable. The battlefield itself became an instrument of German strategy, with mobility and coordination transforming natural and urban terrain into tools of encirclement. By late September, the Southwestern Front was under siege in every practical sense. Units were isolated, reserves depleted, and communications largely disrupted. Breakout attempts, though occasionally successful at a small scale, were insufficient to alter the operational reality. The German pincers were closing with relentless precision. The combination of mechanized mobility, coordinated firepower, psychological pressure, and logistical superiority ensured that Soviet forces faced an almost inevitable encirclement. The battle's progression demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of combined arms warfare against an opponent constrained by rigid command structures, stretched supply lines, and the immense stress of defensive operations. The siege of the Southwestern Front thus exemplified both the resilience of Soviet forces and the overwhelming operational advantage of the Wehrmacht, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and tragic encirclements in military history. Chapter 10: The Closing of the Pincers, final maneuvers. By the final days of September 1941, the German forces around Kiev had reached a stage where the encirclement was no longer a looming threat, but an imminent reality. The northern and southern pincer movements led by Guderian and Kleist were nearing convergence east of the city, compressing the Soviet Southwestern front into an ever-tightening trap. The scale of the operation was extraordinary, involving hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, artillery batteries, and aircraft operating in unison across a front that stretched hundreds of kilometers. Every movement was calculated, coordinated, and executed with precision, leaving Soviet commanders with increasingly limited options and forcing them into reactive measures that could no longer alter the strategic trajectory of the battle. The closing of the pincers involved meticulous operational planning and flawless timing. Guderian's northern thrust had cut deep into the open plains, bypassing fortified Soviet positions and isolating entire divisions, while Kleist's southern advance had captured critical rail hubs, towns, and river crossings that the Red Army had attempted to defend. These converging movements were designed to seal off all potential escape routes, effectively trapping the Soviet forces east of Kiev. Reconnaissance units scouted continuously, identifying vulnerable sectors and guiding armored columns into positions where they could prevent breakthroughs or retreats. Infantry followed closely, securing territory, consolidating gains, and preventing disorganized Soviet units from slipping through the tightening cordon. Every element of the Wehrmacht worked in concert, reinforcing the pressure and ensuring that the encirclement would be executed with minimal gaps. The pace of the German advance created enormous psychological pressure on the trapped Soviet units. Soldiers were constantly aware that retreat was increasingly impossible, while reports of converging German forces fueled fear and uncertainty. Commanders faced the daunting task of maintaining cohesion, discipline, and morale under conditions of extreme stress, with fragmented communications, disrupted supply lines, and constant enemy attacks. Every decision carried profound consequences. Ordering a counterattack could result in catastrophic losses. Attempting a retreat could lead to disorganization, and holding ground risked complete encirclement. The mental strain on both troops and commanders compounded the operational difficulties, highlighting the psychological dimension of modern mechanized warfare and the devastating impact of coordinated rapid assaults on a beleaguered enemy. Tactical maneuvers during this phase emphasized speed, coordination, and the exploitation of Soviet vulnerabilities. German armored divisions advanced in well-coordinated columns, using mobility to bypass strong points and isolate pockets of resistance. Mechanized infantry moved in tandem, securing key positions, protecting the flanks of armored thrusts, and neutralizing localized Soviet counterattacks. Artillery continuously bombarded defensive positions, command centers, and supply depots, while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, providing reconnaissance, interdicting supplies, and supporting ground operations with precision strikes. The integration of these elements created a continuous, multidimensional threat that the Red Army struggled to counter. Every delay or misstep by Soviet forces was quickly exploited, further tightening the pincers and leaving fewer options for maneuver or escape. Despite the overwhelming German advantage, Soviet troops displayed remarkable resilience. Infantry units fortified positions in forests, riverbanks, and towns, attempting to slow armored advances and protect retreating comrades. Tank brigades launched daring counterattacks, seeking to disrupt German formations and open gaps in the encirclement. Artillery units provided covering fire, often at great risk, to allow units to reposition or escape temporarily threatened sectors. These efforts, though courageous, were insufficient to reverse the overall operational dynamics. German mobility, coordination, and firepower ensured that any localized success could not translate into a strategic breakthrough. The gap between tactical heroism and strategic reality became increasingly stark as the pincers drew closer to their intended convergence. Logistical challenges continued to exacerbate the difficulties faced by the Southwestern Front. Soviet units were severely limited in ammunition, fuel, and food, further reducing their operational flexibility. Attempts to resupply trapped units were often thwarted by German interdiction, airstrikes, and the destruction of transport infrastructure. Commanders faced impossible choices regarding resource allocation, often prioritizing some units at the expense of others, leaving portions of the army vulnerable to encirclement. The centralization of command, intended to maintain control over vast formations, proved inadequate in the face of rapid, mechanized enemy operations, highlighting a fundamental structural weakness of the Red Army during the early months of Operation Barbarossa. As the pincers continued to close, the operational tempo left little room for error or improvisation on the Soviet side. Any attempt to organize a breakout or mount a coordinated counteroffensive was met with overwhelming resistance from armored, mechanized, and air-supported forces. German units adjusted their maneuvers dynamically, exploiting terrain, reconnaissance intelligence, and gaps created by Soviet missteps. The battlefield was compressed, forcing Soviet units into increasingly constrained areas where maneuvering became difficult and vulnerability to artillery, armor, and air attack was heightened. The operational environment was a testament to the effectiveness of blitzkrieg when applied with precision, coordination, and psychological insight, demonstrating why the German forces were able to encircle and neutralize such a large and strategically significant front. The final maneuvers of the German pincers also highlighted the effectiveness of combined arms warfare on a grand scale. Armored units, mechanized infantry, artillery, and air support worked seamlessly together, each element reinforcing the other and amplifying operational effects. Reconnaissance provided the real-time intelligence necessary to adapt to battlefield changes, while logistics ensured that units could sustain rapid movement and continuous pressure. The convergence of these factors created an operational environment in which the trapped Soviet forces were increasingly constrained, disorganized, and vulnerable, setting the stage for one of the largest and most consequential encirclements in military history. As the final days of September 1941 unfolded, the convergence of German northern and southern forces east of Kiev transformed the strategic landscape into one of extraordinary peril for the Soviet Southwestern Front. The encirclement was no longer theoretical. It had become a tangible, inescapable reality. Panzer divisions, mechanized infantry, and artillery units coordinated with devastating precision, while the Luftwaffe maintained air superiority that hampered any movement, reconnaissance, or resupply attempts by Soviet forces. The pincers were closing steadily, leaving Soviet units with shrinking options and forcing commanders to make high-stakes decisions under extreme operational pressure. The tactical brilliance of the Wehrmacht, combined with speed, coordination, and relentless pressure, ensured that the Southwestern Front faced imminent catastrophe. The mechanics of the encirclement were both methodical and ruthless. Guderian's northern armored thrust cut through open terrain, bypassing fortified positions and severing retreat paths, while Kleist's southern advance occupied strategic towns, river crossings, and rail lines, blocking avenues for escape or reinforcements. Each maneuver was guided by reconnaissance units that identified weak points, troop movements, and potential escape routes. Mechanized infantry followed armored columns, securing gains, neutralizing resistance, and preventing Soviet units from exploiting minor successes. Artillery continuously bombarded defensive positions, command posts, and supply depots, while aircraft strikes disrupted movements, destroyed infrastructure, and created chaos within trapped formations. The cumulative effect was the systematic compression of the Southwestern Front, turning a broad defensive line into a shrinking pocket where mobility, morale, and options diminished with each passing hour. Psychologically, the trapped Soviet forces faced immense strain. Soldiers understood the encirclement was nearly complete, and the realization of being surrounded generated fear, confusion, and despair. Units attempting to retreat found that German mechanized formations had anticipated their movements, cutting off roads and controlling critical terrain. Commanders had to maintain discipline, issue orders with minimal information, and keep morale from collapsing under the weight of seemingly inevitable defeat. Even acts of courage and tactical ingenuity often proved insufficient. The speed and coordination of German forces rendered many local successes strategically irrelevant. Panic threatened to spread, further disrupting cohesion, as soldiers struggled to balance survival instincts with the demands of military discipline. Tactical decisions during this phase emphasized flexibility and rapid exploitation of Soviet vulnerabilities. German armored columns, moving in tight coordination with infantry, could bypass fortified towns, outflank defensive positions, and strike at rear echelon units responsible for logistics and communications. Artillery and air support maintained continuous pressure, preventing regrouping and ensuring that any attempts to break through the encirclement were swiftly countered. Soviet units, attempting to consolidate positions or organize counterattacks, faced overwhelming firepower and mobility that rendered such maneuvers increasingly dangerous. The operational environment created a sense of inevitability. Every Soviet action was anticipated, countered, or rendered ineffective by the German integration of movement, firepower, and intelligence. Despite these challenges, Soviet forces continued to resist with remarkable tenacity. Infantry units dug trenches, fortified urban structures, and used natural terrain to create choke points and slow armored advances. Tank brigades launched daring raids to disrupt German lines, while artillery provided suppressive fire to cover limited withdrawals or defensive regrouping. Small-scale breakthroughs occurred sporadically, offering temporary relief or escape for select units. Yet the overall operational picture remained grim. The combination of logistical shortages, fragmented communications, and relentless German pressure meant that these efforts could not alter the fundamental reality of the encirclement. The Southwestern Front's valiant resistance highlighted both the courage of individual soldiers and the strategic consequences of systemic vulnerabilities under blitzkrieg conditions. Logistical considerations were critical in determining the final outcome of the Pincer closure. Soviet supply lines were increasingly compromised by German attacks on railways, roads, and depots, leaving troops with insufficient ammunition, fuel, and food. Efforts to reinforce beleaguered units were often thwarted by speed of the German advance and the fragmentation of command directives. Armies attempting to reorganize for breakout operations faced immense difficulties, with insufficient resources to support sustained action. German planning had accounted for these logistical weaknesses, deliberately targeting infrastructure and disrupting supply networks to enhance the psychological and operational impact of encirclement. By the end of September, the German pincers had nearly met, effectively isolating the Southwestern Front and sealing its fate. The remaining Soviet formations faced dwindling options, trapped within a shrinking area under constant assault from armor, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. The operational effectiveness of German combined arms, the speed of mechanized units, and the coordination of artillery and air support had achieved a near-perfect encirclement. For the Soviet commanders and soldiers, survival depended on improvisation, local tactical skill, and the occasional success of small breakout attempts. The larger strategic reality, however, was clear. The closing of the pincers represented one of the most decisive operational maneuvers of the early Eastern Front, demonstrating both the strengths of blitzkrieg and the vulnerabilities of a rigid, overstretched defense. The final maneuvers of the German pincers around Kiev not only exemplified operational brilliance, but also highlighted the critical importance of coordination, speed, and psychological insight in modern warfare. The interplay of armored mobility, mechanized infantry support, artillery bombardment, and air superiority created conditions in which Soviet numerical strength could not compensate for strategic, logistical, and operational deficiencies. By forcing the Southwestern Front into an almost inescapable pocket, the Wehrmacht achieved a level of operational success that would have profound consequences for the Eastern Front and for the Red Army's understanding of mechanized warfare. The closing of the pincers was both a tactical and psychological triumph, underscoring the deadly effectiveness of integrated blitzkrieg operations in shaping the outcome of one of the largest encirclements in military history. Chapter 11. The Human Cost of Encirclement, Soldiers and Civilians. As the encirclement of the Soviet Southwestern Front around Kiev reached its final stages in late September 1941, the human cost of the operation became increasingly stark. Soldiers, civilians, and local populations were caught in an unfolding catastrophe that combined the brutality of modern mechanized warfare with the psychological trauma of imminent entrapment. For the troops, the battlefield was no longer merely a contest of strategy or firepower. It had transformed into a test of endurance, courage, and resourcefulness under extreme pressure. The relentless advance of German armored and mechanized units, combined with the constant threat of artillery and aerial bombardment, created a suffocating environment where survival was uncertain, morale was continuously tested, and tactical decision-making became a race against time. Frontline soldiers faced unimaginable pressures. Many units had already been weakened by weeks of retreat, skirmishes, and attrition. Supplies of food, ammunition, and medical resources were increasingly scarce, creating an additional layer of vulnerability. Infantrymen had to hold defensive positions while knowing that any attempt to retreat or maneuver could be blocked by fast-moving German panzer formations. Tank brigades, despite heroic efforts to disrupt German advances, frequently found themselves outnumbered, outflanked, or lacking fuel and ammunition to sustain operations. The continuous stress of combat, combined with the fear of being trapped, created psychological strain that could sap cohesion, discipline, and morale. Individual acts of heroism were common, yet the cumulative effect of fatigue, fear, and isolation posed a relentless challenge to Soviet command and unit effectiveness. Civilians in the encirclement zone faced equally dire circumstances. With towns and villages caught between advancing German forces and retreating Soviet troops, evacuation routes were congested, dangerous, or blocked entirely. Families attempted to flee with whatever belongings they could carry, often navigating roads under artillery fire and air attacks. Refugees created additional logistical complications for Soviet units attempting to maneuver or withdraw, while the psychological impact of witnessing destruction, death, and chaos further strained both soldiers and civilians. Hospitals, shelters, and emergency facilities were overwhelmed, leaving many wounded or displaced without adequate care. The human experience of the encirclement extended far beyond the battlefield, encompassing an entire region gripped by fear, uncertainty, and deprivation. Communication breakdowns exacerbated the human cost. Soldiers trapped in isolated pockets often had no way to contact higher command or neighboring units, leaving them unable to coordinate movements or request reinforcements. Conflicting orders from Soviet command further complicated matters, with some units ordered to hold positions while others were directed to attempt breakout maneuvers. The result was disorganization, duplication of effort, and missed opportunities for coordinated defense or escape. Commanders faced the impossible task of maintaining control over troops under extreme stress while attempting to navigate a rapidly deteriorating operational situation. These failures in command and communication intensified both physical and psychological vulnerabilities, magnifying the human toll of the encirclement. Medical care and casualty management became increasingly critical, yet practically impossible. Frontline hospitals and medical personnel were overwhelmed by the number of wounded soldiers and civilians, many of whom suffered from injuries, exhaustion, and exposure. Evacuation of the wounded was severely limited by disrupted transport routes and ongoing combat, leaving many to face death or severe suffering in place. The lack of sufficient medical care compounded the psychological strain on troops, as soldiers were forced to witness the suffering of comrades without being able to provide assistance. This created a cycle in which physical danger, psychological pressure, and logistical limitations reinforced one another, heightening the overall human cost of the siege. Supply shortages added another layer of desperation. Food, ammunition, and fuel were limited, with many units forced to ration resources or improvise solutions under fire. Troops had to make critical decisions about prioritizing resources, which units received ammunition, which roads could be cleared for supply convoys, and how to allocate remaining medical and logistical support. Civilians, meanwhile, faced starvation and exposure, further compounding the humanitarian crisis. The scarcity of essential resources turned everyday survival into a tactical and moral challenge, forcing both commanders and soldiers to navigate difficult choices in an environment of extreme scarcity. Despite these challenges, acts of courage, resourcefulness, and resilience were widespread. Soldiers improvised defensive positions, coordinated counterattacks under heavy fire, and attempted breakout maneuvers to preserve units from encirclement. Civilians assisted each other in evacuation, improvised shelters, and supported military efforts where possible, demonstrating remarkable endurance under extreme adversity. These stories of determination, while often overshadowed by the scale of loss, underscore the human dimension of the battle and the capacity for resilience even in catastrophic circumstances. The encirclement of Kiev thus illustrates not only operational and strategic consequences, but also the profound human cost of warfare. Soldiers faced exhaustion, isolation, and the constant threat of annihilation, while civilians endured displacement, deprivation, and fear. Communication failures, logistical shortages, and relentless enemy pressure amplified these challenges, creating a comprehensive humanitarian and military crisis. The siege of the Southwestern Front provides a stark example of how mechanized warfare, operational precision, and strategic miscalculations intersect to create situations in which human endurance is tested to its limits, shaping both the course of battle and the experiences of those caught within it. As the German pincers closed around Kiev in the final days of September 1941, the human toll of the encirclement became increasingly apparent. For Soviet soldiers trapped within the shrinking perimeter, every day presented new challenges of survival, endurance, and decision-making under extreme duress. Exhausted from weeks of retreat, skirmishes, and relentless bombardment, troops were now confined to increasingly narrow areas, where maneuver was limited and vulnerability to German attacks was high. Infantry units, despite determination and discipline, faced the constant threat of artillery shelling, aerial bombardment, and armored assaults. Even small groups attempting to retreat or reposition risked being cut off, surrounded, or annihilated, leaving survival dependent on rapid improvisation, coordination with neighboring units, and sheer determination. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. Many understood that their chances of escape were diminishing with each passing hour. Reports of encroaching German armored formations, combined with constant air attacks, created a sense of inevitability, amplifying stress and fear. Units faced both physical danger and the moral dilemma of abandoning comrades who were wounded or cut off. Commanders were forced to make high-stakes decisions regarding troop movements, defensive positions, and allocation of scarce resources. Each choice carried the weight of life or death for hundreds or thousands of men, heightening the emotional and psychological strain. These pressures were intensified by fragmented communications, with many units unable to coordinate effectively or receive guidance from higher command, leaving individual commanders to make critical decisions in isolation. Civilians in the encirclement zone experienced parallel hardships. Roads and bridges were clogged with refugees attempting to escape advancing German forces, creating logistical challenges for both military and civilian populations. Many towns had been bombed or shelled, leaving residents without shelter or access to food, water, or medical care. Families fled with whatever belongings they could carry, often walking for miles under enemy fire or through dangerous terrain. Hospitals, schools, and makeshift shelters were overwhelmed, leaving countless wounded, sick, or elderly civilians without adequate care. The interaction between civilian displacement and military operations intensified the chaos, as Soviet troops struggled to protect non-combatants while attempting to organize defensive or breakout actions under relentless pressure. Medical care for both soldiers and civilians was severely constrained. Field hospitals were overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded, and evacuation routes were frequently cut off by German advances or air attacks. Supplies of medical equipment, bandages, and medicines were limited, forcing medics and surgeons to improvise under extreme conditions. Soldiers were forced to witness the suffering of comrades without being able to provide assistance, and civilians often had no access to basic care. These conditions contributed not only to mortality, but also to the psychological trauma experienced by survivors. The human cost of the encirclement was thus both physical and emotional, encompassing death, injury, deprivation, and prolonged suffering. Logistical shortages further exacerbated the plight of those trapped. Ammunition, fuel, and food supplies were increasingly scarce, leaving both soldiers and civilians vulnerable. Infantry units had to ration ammunition, artillery units struggled to maintain firepower, and armored divisions faced limited fuel for maneuver. Civilians, cut off from supply lines, often faced starvation, exposure, and disease. The scarcity of essential resources heightened the sense of desperation and limited the ability of Soviet forces to conduct coordinated defensive operations or organized retreats. Every decision regarding resource allocation carried life or death consequences, adding another layer of psychological strain to an already harrowing situation. Acts of resilience and bravery were widespread despite overwhelming odds. Soldiers dug improvised defensive positions, coordinated small-scale counterattacks, and attempted daring breakouts to protect units from encirclement. Tank crews risked annihilation to disrupt German formations, while infantry units held choke points against overwhelming forces. Civilians, too, displayed extraordinary endurance, assisting each other in evacuation, sheltering the wounded, and supporting limited defensive efforts where possible. These acts, though often overshadowed by the scale of loss, highlight the human capacity for courage and resourcefulness even under catastrophic circumstances. They provide a window into the lived experiences of those trapped within one of the largest encirclements in military history. The culmination of these factors, the relentless German assault, logistical shortages, fragmented command, psychological stress, and civilian suffering, underscores the profound human cost of the Kiev encirclement. The trapped Soviet Southwestern Front was not only facing operational defeat, but a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. The experiences of soldiers and civilians alike demonstrate how mechanized warfare, operational precision, and strategic miscalculations converge to create conditions in which endurance, courage, and improvisation are tested to the limit. The Siege of Kiev thus remains a stark illustration of the intersection between military strategy and human experience, revealing the full spectrum of consequences when operational brilliance meets human vulnerability in war. Chapter 12: Soviet Breakout Attempts and Countermeasures. As the German encirclement of Kiev tightened in early October 1941, the Soviet Southwestern Front faced the urgent need to attempt breakout operations to avoid total annihilation. The situation was increasingly desperate. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped in a shrinking pocket, supplies were critically low, and morale was being steadily eroded by continuous artillery bombardments, air attacks, and the rapid maneuvering of German armored units. Soviet commanders understood that staying in place without attempting a breakout would likely result in the complete destruction of the front, but organizing coordinated operations under these conditions was extraordinarily difficult. The logistical, psychological, and operational pressures created a complex environment in which success required not only bold action but precise timing, coordination, and a measure of luck. The planning of breakout operations began under extremely challenging circumstances. Communication between different Soviet formations was fragmented, with many units isolated by German advances and disrupted rail and road networks. Commanders were forced to make rapid assessments of enemy positions, determine the best avenues for attack, and allocate scarce resources, all while under constant threat from Luftwaffe air raids and armored reconnaissance units. Any miscalculation could be catastrophic. A misaligned attack or premature movement could lead to exposure to concentrated German fire, severing the last connections between trapped units and cutting off potential escape routes. Despite these challenges, Soviet leaders recognized that bold action was essential to preserve the lives of their troops and maintain the integrity of the front, however limited its chances of success. The execution of breakout attempts relied heavily on the coordination of remaining armored units, infantry brigades, and artillery support. Tanks were tasked with spearheading attacks to punch through German lines, exploiting weak points or creating temporary breaches that infantry could follow. Artillery was employed to suppress enemy positions, soften defenses, and disrupt German counterattacks. Infantry units, often exhausted and low on supplies, were called upon to hold captured ground, protect armored flanks, and secure key terrain. In many instances, these breakout operations occurred at night or under the cover of poor visibility to reduce the effectiveness of German air reconnaissance and bombardment. The combination of surprise, speed, and concentrated force was intended to maximize the limited resources available and increase the probability of success. Despite careful planning, the breakout attempts faced significant obstacles. German forces, anticipating the possibility of such operations, had already fortified key positions, established overlapping fields of fire, and positioned armored reserves to counter thrusts. The coordination between German panzer units, mechanized infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe aircraft allowed rapid response to any Soviet penetration, often nullifying the effects of initial breakthroughs. Soviet troops attempting to navigate the increasingly compressed battlefield encountered minefields, destroyed bridges, and relentless bombardment, further complicating movement and reducing the potential for a coordinated breakout. Each advance was met with intense resistance, and the margin for error was extraordinarily narrow, making the human and operational stakes exceptionally high. The psychological and physical strain on Soviet soldiers attempting breakout operations was extreme. Exhausted from weeks of continuous engagement, many troops were low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Communication failures meant that units often advanced with incomplete information about enemy positions or the status of neighboring formations. Soldiers faced the dual pressures of avoiding German fire while coordinating with their own comrades, creating a chaotic and dangerous environment. Panic could spread quickly in such conditions, yet many units exhibited remarkable resilience. Using improvisation, local terrain knowledge, and determination to press forward under impossible odds. The human element, endurance, courage, and tactical intuition, became as crucial as operational planning in determining whether a breakout would succeed or fail. Local countermeasures implemented by the Red Army added complexity to the breakout attempts. Commanders often attempted diversionary attacks, feints, or coordinated artillery barges to distract German forces and create opportunities for concentrated breakthroughs. Small partisan or reconnaissance units sometimes infiltrated enemy lines to gather intelligence, sabotage equipment, or disrupt communication networks. While these measures occasionally produced temporary advantages, the overwhelming coordination, mobility, and firepower of German forces frequently negated their effects. Soviet troops had to constantly adapt, balancing the need for aggressive action with the imperative to preserve remaining manpower and equipment in the face of an increasingly lethal encirclement. Logistical limitations further constrained the breakout operations. Fuel for armored units was scarce, ammunition supplies were insufficient for prolonged engagements, and medical support was limited or unavailable. Infantry units had to carry what they could, often moving over long distances under enemy fire and through difficult terrain. Civilians in the area complicated operations, as retreating populations blocked roads and occupied key infrastructure. Despite these challenges, Soviet commanders attempted to coordinate movements along critical axes, focusing on exploiting weaknesses in the German encirclement and maintaining cohesion across disparate units. The interplay between operational planning, tactical execution, and logistical realities defined the precarious nature of the breakout attempts, highlighting both the determination of Soviet forces and the challenges imposed by the encirclement. The breakout operations of the Southwestern Front illustrate the complexity of large-scale maneuvers under extreme pressure. They were not merely tactical exercises, but desperate measures to preserve the integrity of a collapsing front and save lives. The combination of exhausted troops, disrupted communications, limited supplies, and formidable enemy defenses created an environment in which each decision carried enormous consequences. Despite heroic efforts, the probability of success remained uncertain, emphasizing the lethal effectiveness of German operational coordination and the immense challenges faced by Soviet commanders under the most adverse conditions. The human dimension, intertwined with operational planning and battlefield realities, was central to the unfolding drama of the Kiev encirclement. As the first attempts at breaking out of the encirclement unfolded in early October 1941, Soviet forces faced a harsh reality. The German cordon was tighter and more coordinated than anticipated. Despite careful planning, the combination of fast-moving panzer divisions, mechanized infantry, continuous artillery fire, and air superiority left few avenues for large-scale successful escape. Soviet commanders had to contend with fragmented units, disrupted supply lines, and the exhaustion of soldiers who had already endured weeks of relentless combat and retreat. The breakout efforts became a complex interplay between strategic improvisation, local tactical ingenuity, and sheer human endurance, as commanders and soldiers alike sought to preserve life while continuing to resist overwhelming odds. Initial breakthroughs often proved ephemeral. Tank brigades managed to penetrate German lines in select sectors, creating temporary corridors through which infantry could advance. These limited successes, however, were frequently countered by rapid German redeployment, airstrikes, and artillery barges that closed the gaps almost as quickly as they had been opened. Mechanized infantry units, moving to secure newly captured territory, sometimes encountered minefields, destroyed bridges, or natural obstacles that slowed progress and exposed them to concentrated attacks. Each failed or stalled effort not only consumed precious resources, but also reinforced the perception of German omnipresence and operational superiority, affecting morale across the encircled forces. Soviet units attempted to maximize the effectiveness of their limited resources through coordination and surprise. Night movements, use of forested areas, and diversionary attacks were employed to confuse German forces and create openings for breakthrough attempts. Small reconnaissance and partisan detachments infiltrated German positions to gather intelligence, sabotage equipment, or disrupt supply and communication lines, hoping to tip the balance in favor of advancing Soviet troops. These localized initiatives were essential in an operational environment where conventional strategies were increasingly unviable. Soldiers relied heavily on terrain, concealment, and timing to achieve even marginal gains, knowing that a single lapse could lead to isolation or destruction by superior enemy forces. The psychological and physical toll of repeated breakout attempts was immense. Troops operated under constant fear of encirclement, artillery bombardment, and air attacks, often with minimal food, water, and ammunition. Commanders had to maintain unit cohesion, morale, and operational focus despite these severe conditions. Panic, exhaustion, and despair threatened to erode discipline. Yet many soldiers displayed remarkable resilience, improvising solutions, maintaining communication under duress, and continuing to fight against overwhelming odds. The human dimension, endurance, courage, and tactical ingenuity, became as crucial as strategic planning in determining whether breakout attempts would achieve even temporary success. Local countermeasures against German forces were essential in sustaining these breakout operations. Soviet artillery targeted key supply lines and assembly points, while small infantry detachments launched raids to disrupt German armored columns and delay counterattacks. These measures, though limited in scale, sometimes bought critical time for trapped units to reposition or move through narrow corridors. Diversionary attacks, feints, and controlled withdrawals were employed to mislead German commanders and open pockets for temporary movement. Each of these actions required precise coordination under the constraints of disrupted communications, limited intelligence, and constant pressure, illustrating the improvisational skill and adaptability of Soviet units in the face of overwhelming operational constraints, despite heroic efforts. The overall impact of Soviet breakout operations was constrained by the overwhelming coordination and firepower of German forces. Rapid armored redeployments, integrated air support, and concentrated artillery fire frequently neutralized breakthroughs before they could be exploited. The shrinking operational space forced Soviet units into increasingly confined areas, where maneuvering was limited and vulnerability to encirclement grew. Small-scale successes, though important for morale and local survival, could not alter the broader strategic reality. The Southwestern Front remained effectively trapped, and the German forces retained the initiative at every turn. The interplay between operational planning, resource limitations, and human endurance defined the final stages of these breakout attempts. Soldiers were forced to navigate a battlefield where each decision carried life or death consequences, where resources were scarce, and where the speed and coordination of the enemy left little room for error. Commanders relied on the courage, discipline, and tactical skill of their troops to execute desperate maneuvers in the hope of preserving units and maintaining the integrity of the front. The human cost of these efforts was enormous, with high casualties, exhaustion, and psychological trauma characterizing the experience of units attempting to break free from the encirclement. Ultimately, the Soviet breakout attempts demonstrated both the resilience and the limitations of a trapped army under extreme operational pressure. The coordination, speed, and firepower of the German forces imposed a relentless operational constraint, while the ingenuity, courage, and perseverance of Soviet troops provided fleeting moments of tactical success. The dynamic between these opposing forces illustrates the interplay of strategy, tactics, logistics, and human endurance in one of the most complex and consequential encirclements of the Second World War. The breakout attempts, though largely unsuccessful at a strategic level, underscore the extraordinary challenges faced by the Southwestern Front and highlight the capacity of human determination to persist even in the face of near-total operational collapse. Chapter 13. The Luftwaffe's Role and Air Supremacy. As the German encirclement of Kiev intensified in late September and early October 1941, the Luftwaffe emerged as a decisive force shaping the operational environment and contributing significantly to the collapse of the Soviet Southwestern Front. Air superiority was no longer a supporting element, but a central factor in the success of the German encirclement strategy. The Luftwaffe's ability to conduct reconnaissance, interdiction, close air support, and strategic bombardment allowed the Wehrmacht to dominate both the battlefield and the psychological landscape, constraining Soviet maneuvering, isolating units, and amplifying the effects of armored and mechanized operations. The scale and precision of air operations in the Kiev encirclement provide a remarkable illustration of how air power could decisively influence land warfare during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. Reconnaissance missions were among the most crucial contributions of the Luftwaffe to the Kiev encirclement. Constant aerial surveillance enabled German commanders to monitor Soviet troop movements, identify weak points in defensive lines, and track retreating units in real time. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over both open plains and forested areas, often under hostile conditions, to provide accurate intelligence that informed the timing and placement of armored thrusts. This intelligence allowed panzer divisions to bypass heavily fortified positions, concentrate force on vulnerable sectors, and anticipate Soviet counterattacks. By denying the Soviets the ability to move undetected, Luftwaffe reconnaissance created a continuous operational pressure that amplified the effectiveness of the German pincer movements and forced Soviet commanders into reactive, rather than proactive, postures. Close air support was equally critical in shaping battlefield outcomes. Dive bombers, fighter bombers, and medium bombers coordinated with ground units to deliver precision strikes against Soviet infantry, artillery positions, and fortifications. Armored spearheads benefited from this support, as Luftwaffe aircraft neutralized enemy positions that could have otherwise slowed or halted panzer advances. Infantry units following the armored columns were able to secure territory more effectively because Soviet defenses were disrupted from the air. The psychological impact of these air attacks on soldiers in the encircled Southwestern front was profound. Continuous bombardment created fear, disorientation, and fatigue, further weakening the cohesion and resilience of units already stretched thin by weeks of combat and retreat. Strategic bombardment targeted infrastructure, communication networks, and supply lines, compounding the operational challenges faced by Soviet forces. Rail lines, bridges, depots, and road networks were subjected to repeated strikes, preventing reinforcements, resupply, or coordinated troop movements. Artillery and tank units could be isolated or deprived of ammunition, while the destruction of roads and bridges impeded any attempted breakout or retreat. The integration of strategic bombing with ground maneuvers and tactical air support created a multidimensional operational effect that the Red Army struggled to counter. Each disruption in logistics or communication not only hindered tactical movements, but also increased psychological stress among soldiers, reinforcing the sense of inevitability as German forces closed the encirclement. Air superiority allowed the Luftwaffe to operate with relative impunity over the encircled zone. Soviet air forces, although present, were largely unable to contest German dominance due to losses suffered earlier in Operation Barbarossa, poor coordination, and logistical limitations. The absence of effective opposition in the skies allowed the Luftwaffe to conduct reconnaissance, interdiction, and bombing missions with minimal risk, ensuring that German ground forces were consistently supported and informed. This unchallenged air presence magnified the effectiveness of pincer operations, turning the sky itself into a tactical and psychological instrument of encirclement. Soviet forces, lacking the ability to influence or challenge German air operations, were forced to conduct movements under constant observation and threat from above. The Luftwaffe also played a crucial role in isolating units attempting breakout operations. Soldiers attempting to move through narrow corridors or forested areas were subjected to aerial bombardment and strafing runs, disrupting formations and inflicting casualties. Armored and mechanized units attempting to exploit gaps in German lines found their movements anticipated or countered by air attacks, further limiting the potential for successful breakthroughs. Even small-scale diversionary attacks or reconnaissance efforts were frequently neutralized by the presence of German aircraft overhead, underscoring the integral role of air power in both defensive and offensive operations during the encirclement. In addition to direct combat effects, the Luftwaffe's actions had profound psychological consequences. Soldiers trapped within the encirclement faced constant awareness of German planes overhead, creating an omnipresent sense of vulnerability. Artillery barges, combined with strafing and bombing, eroded confidence and morale, inducing panic or hesitation that could be fatal in a fluid operational environment. Civilians fleeing the advancing front were also directly affected by air attacks, heightening the humanitarian crisis and complicating Soviet defensive efforts. The psychological pressure exerted from the air complemented the physical and operational pressures on the ground, creating a comprehensive system of control that left the Southwestern Front with few effective options. The integration of reconnaissance, close air support, and strategic interdiction made the Luftwaffe indispensable to the success of the German encirclement at Kiev. Its actions magnified the operational effectiveness of ground units, reduced the feasibility of Soviet countermeasures, and amplified both physical and psychological pressure on troops and civilians. The example of the Luftwaffe's role in the Kiev encirclement illustrates the transformative impact of air power in modern mechanized warfare, showing how control of the skies can dictate outcomes on the ground, influence strategic decisions, and shape the human experience of battle. As the encirclement of Kiev progressed, the Luftwaffe's role evolved from reconnaissance and tactical support to comprehensive dominance over the operational environment. By early October 1941, German air units were not only facilitating armored advances, but also shaping the entire battlefield in a manner that constrained Soviet options and amplified the lethality of ground operations. The integration of air power into the German operational doctrine allowed for continuous pressure on Soviet formations, targeted disruption of logistical networks, and an almost unrelenting psychological strain on both soldiers and civilians. The operational synergy between air and ground forces transformed the Kiev encirclement into a multidimensional engagement in which control of the skies became inseparable from success on the ground. German reconnaissance missions continued to play a critical role during the final stages of the encirclement. Aircraft conducted constant patrols over vast areas, tracking the movements of isolated Soviet units, monitoring supply lines, and identifying potential breakout points. The intelligence gathered allowed armored and mechanized formations to adjust their movements dynamically, concentrate forces on vulnerable sectors, and anticipate Soviet maneuvers. Even minor shifts in unit positions were detected and rapidly countered by German ground forces, reflecting the precision and responsiveness that Luftwaffe reconnaissance afforded. The consistent presence of reconnaissance aircraft ensured that Soviet commanders were rarely able to move undetected, forcing reactive decisions and limiting the feasibility of coordinated countermeasures. Close air support during this phase intensified, targeting Soviet defensive positions, artillery emplacements, and armored groupings attempting to slow the German advance. Dive bombers and fighter bombers were dispatched to provide real-time support for panzer units breaching Soviet lines, neutralizing strongpoints that could have impeded progress. Infantry movements were similarly aided, as Luftwaffe strikes suppressed enemy positions that might otherwise have slowed consolidation of newly captured territory. The effectiveness of close air support was magnified by coordination with artillery and armored maneuvers, creating a multi-layered pressure system in which Soviet forces were simultaneously threatened from above, at ground level, and by artillery fire. Each of these elements reinforced the others, increasing both operational efficiency and the psychological impact on defenders. Strategic interdiction by the Luftwaffe targeted supply lines, transportation networks, and communications infrastructure, effectively isolating Soviet units and constraining the potential for resupply or coordinated breakout operations. Railways and bridges were bombed systematically, roads were rendered impassable, and key depots were destroyed, leaving encircled forces with dwindling ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The continuous disruption of logistics intensified operational vulnerability and forced commanders to prioritize scarce resources for immediate survival rather than offensive action. Civilians attempting to flee were also impeded, heightening both the humanitarian crisis and the operational complexity faced by the Red Army. This deliberate targeting of infrastructure demonstrates the Luftwaffe's strategic awareness and its capacity to shape the battlefield beyond immediate tactical engagements. Attempts at Soviet breakout or counterattacks were continually mitigated by air dominance. Units moving through forests, urban areas, or along narrow corridors faced persistent risk from strafing and bombing runs. Temporary breaches in German lines were rapidly countered by Luftwaffe strikes, which disrupted formations, inflicted casualties, and delayed movements critical to breakout success. Even small-scale reconnaissance or diversionary operations by Soviet forces were neutralized by aerial observation, demonstrating how control of the air allowed the Germans to anticipate and suppress threats before they could gain traction. This dominance created a cascading operational effect. The harder the Soviets pressed for breakout or counterattack, the more effectively the Luftwaffe amplified German operational responses. The psychological consequences of continuous air operations were profound. Soldiers endured the constant sound of engines, explosions, and the threat of sudden attacks from above, contributing to fatigue, stress, and diminished cohesion. Even well-led and determined units struggled to maintain focus under these conditions, as fear of aerial attack compounded existing pressures from artillery and ground assaults. Civilians, similarly, experienced terror and dislocation as air raids struck towns and evacuation routes. The omnipresence of the Luftwaffe created an almost tangible sense of inevitability. The sky itself had become a weapon, enforcing the operational logic of encirclement and magnifying the human cost of the siege. Coordination between air, artillery, and ground units exemplified the operational sophistication of German forces. Reconnaissance aircraft provided real-time intelligence, allowing artillery and armored units to exploit weaknesses with precision. Close air support neutralized threats to advancing infantry, while strategic bombing disrupted supply chains essential for both frontline and rear echelon operations. The cumulative effect was an environment in which Soviet forces were continually harassed, increasingly isolated, and under psychological and physical stress. This integration demonstrates how modern mechanized warfare had evolved, where mastery of the air could decisively influence outcomes on the ground and shape both operational success and human experience. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe's contribution to the Kiev encirclement highlights the transformative power of air supremacy in modern warfare. By providing reconnaissance, direct support, and strategic interdiction, German air forces magnified the effectiveness of armored and mechanized operations, constrained Soviet options, and imposed psychological pressure on soldiers and civilians alike. The Kiev encirclement illustrates that control of the skies was not merely an auxiliary element, but a central pillar of operational strategy, essential to the execution of one of the most significant encirclements of the Second World War. The Luftwaffe's dominance ensured that the German advance was relentless, precise, and overwhelmingly effective, underscoring the decisive role of integrated air power in shaping the outcome of the battle. Chapter 14: Collapse of Soviet Resistance and Capitulation. By mid-October 1941, the encirclement of Kiev had reached its full operational effect, and the collapse of Soviet resistance became increasingly inevitable. The German pincers had tightened completely, leaving the Southwestern front trapped in a shrinking, deadly pocket. Soviet troops were exhausted, depleted by weeks of retreat, constant bombardment, and attrition from continuous engagement with mechanized and armored German forces. Communication lines were fragmented or destroyed, supply chains were completely disrupted, and morale had plummeted under the relentless pressure of artillery, air attacks, and encroaching enemy formations. Commanders were forced to make impossible choices in an environment where any movement risked annihilation, and the distinction between strategic necessity and human cost became tragically blurred. The final collapse of Soviet defensive efforts was precipitated by several converging factors. The encirclement had effectively neutralized the operational mobility of entire armies, trapping units in a confined space where maneuvering was severely restricted. Armored and mechanized German divisions exploited gaps in Soviet lines, while infantry units occupied critical terrain to block potential breakout routes. Artillery and Luftwaffe air support created a constant, multidimensional threat, disrupting formations, preventing reinforcement, and inflicting heavy casualties. The cumulative impact of these pressures left Soviet troops physically and psychologically exhausted, struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of an overwhelming and methodical enemy offensive. Breakdown in command structures further accelerated the collapse. Soviet headquarters struggled to issue coherent orders as communication lines were severed and units became increasingly isolated. Conflicting directives from higher echelons created confusion, with some units ordered to hold positions while others were instructed to attempt breakout operations. This discord undermined coordination, leaving many divisions exposed to German fire and unable to support neighboring units. Even experienced commanders faced the daunting task of maintaining operational effectiveness under conditions of extreme uncertainty and danger. The breakdown of command and control highlighted the structural vulnerabilities of the Red Army at this stage of the war, emphasizing the interplay between organizational deficiencies and operational collapse. Physical exhaustion among troops was compounded by severe shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Soldiers faced the challenge of continuing combat operations while managing fatigue, injury, and exposure to the elements. Units attempting to resist German advances often did so with insufficient weapons or ammunition, relying on courage and determination to compensate for material deficiencies. Field hospitals and medical personnel were overwhelmed, leaving many wounded without adequate care. Civilians trapped in the encirclement faced starvation, disease, and violence, adding another layer of human tragedy to the military disaster. The combination of physical deprivation, constant threat, and psychological strain created conditions in which sustained resistance was increasingly untenable. Attempts at local resistance and counterattacks, while often heroic, were largely insufficient to alter the trajectory of the battle. Infantry units launched small-scale offensives to slow German advances or protect retreating comrades, while tank brigades attempted to punch through the encirclement at critical points. Artillery barges were used to disrupt German formations, and partisan detachments sought to create diversions. These efforts, though courageous, were unable to counteract the coordinated, rapid, and overwhelming strength of German mechanized forces, artillery, and air support. Every tactical success was temporary, and each failed attempt further depleted resources, morale, and the operational cohesion necessary to mount an effective defense. Psychologically, the trapped Soviet soldiers faced an environment of relentless stress and fear. The omnipresence of German aircraft, artillery bombardment, and armored units created a sense of inescapable pressure. Units attempting to maneuver or reposition risked destruction, while attempts at coordination were hindered by communication failures. Panic occasionally spread through isolated formations, contributing to disorder and increasing vulnerability to concentrated attacks. Commanders faced the constant challenge of maintaining discipline, morale, and operational focus under extreme duress, recognizing that even minor lapses could have catastrophic consequences. The collapse of resistance was therefore not only a matter of physical attrition, but also the cumulative effect of sustained psychological pressure, exhaustion, and fear. Encirclement had also created logistical nightmares that exacerbated the operational collapse. Supplies of food, water, ammunition, and fuel were insufficient to sustain either defensive operations or potential breakout attempts. Soldiers and commanders had to make difficult choices regarding allocation, prioritizing immediate survival over strategic objectives. The destruction of infrastructure, combined with continuous enemy interdiction, meant that even well-planned movements were frequently delayed or rendered impossible. This scarcity intensified both physical vulnerability and psychological stress, highlighting the critical role of logistics in determining the effectiveness and longevity of military resistance under siege conditions. As October progressed, the inevitability of capitulation became clear. The German forces' operational coordination, combined arms tactics, air superiority, and relentless pressure left the Soviet Southwestern Front with dwindling options. Units were trapped in a constricted area, facing constant attack and unable to receive reinforcements, resupply, or coherent orders. The human cost was immense, with heavy casualties among soldiers and civilians, widespread suffering, and the psychological toll of hopelessness. Even organized breakout attempts were largely unsuccessful, underscoring the operational brilliance of the German encirclement strategy and the vulnerabilities of a front stretched beyond its logistical and operational capacity. The final stages of the collapse were marked by the systematic surrender of isolated units, desperate last stands in towns and villages, and chaotic attempts by small groups to escape encirclement. The German forces, fully aware of the operational and symbolic significance of total victory, pressed forward relentlessly, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air power to prevent any consolidation of resistance. The collapse of the Southwestern Front illustrates how operational planning, firepower, coordination, and psychological pressure intersect in modern warfare, transforming strategic encirclement into a mechanism of both military and human devastation. As the encirclement of Kiev reached its final phase in mid-October 1941, the collapse of Soviet resistance became increasingly complete. The Southwestern Front, once a sprawling and formidable formation, was now confined to a shrinking area with few options for maneuver or escape. German forces had achieved operational dominance through the integration of armored columns, mechanized infantry, artillery, and air support, leaving the Red Army trapped in a tactical vice. Soldiers faced an environment where every movement was hazardous, every decision carried the weight of survival, and any lapse could result in immediate destruction. The collapse was both physical and psychological, shaped by overwhelming firepower, coordination, and the relentless pressure of encirclement. Attempts at localized resistance persisted, but their impact was limited and largely symbolic. Infantry units held defensive positions in towns, along rivers, and in forested areas, using natural terrain to slow German advances. Tank brigades launched counterattacks in a desperate bid to punch through the encirclement, often achieving temporary gains that were quickly nullified by concentrated German fire and air strikes. Artillery units, operating under severe logistical constraints, provided suppressive fire to cover retreating units or protect vulnerable sectors. Yet these actions could not alter the overall strategic reality. The cumulative effect of attrition, isolation, and lack of supplies meant that even the most valiant resistance was insufficient to change the outcome of the encirclement. The human dimension of the collapse was stark. Soldiers endured extreme fatigue, hunger, and exposure, while facing constant bombardment from the air and ground. The psychological strain of knowing that escape was increasingly unlikely compounded the physical hardships, creating an environment of fear, stress, and desperation. Civilians trapped within the encirclement experienced parallel suffering, with disrupted evacuation routes, destroyed infrastructure, and limited access to food and medical care. The interplay between military collapse and humanitarian crisis illustrates how operational outcomes are inseparable from their impact on human lives, highlighting the dual consequences of encirclement in modern mechanized warfare. Command and control challenges intensified during these final stages. Fragmented communications prevented coordinated action, leaving isolated units to make decisions under extreme uncertainty. Conflicting orders from higher command created confusion, with some divisions attempting defensive operations while others sought to move toward perceived breakout points. These misalignments further reduced operational cohesion and exposed units to concentrated German counterattacks. Commanders were forced to navigate an environment in which conventional strategies were largely unfeasible, relying instead on improvisation, local knowledge, and the courage of their soldiers. The collapse of command structures illustrates how the breakdown of coordination can accelerate operational defeat, particularly under conditions of encirclement and sustained pressure. Supply shortages played a critical role in the disintegration of resistance. Ammunition was depleted, artillery shells were limited, and fuel for armored units was exhausted, leaving many troops unable to mount sustained defense or counterattack. Food and water scarcity further reduced endurance and morale, while medical supplies were insufficient to treat the wounded. Soldiers were forced to prioritize survival over strategic action, often abandoning equipment or positions to conserve energy and resources. Civilians, caught in the crossfire and cut off from supply lines, faced starvation, disease, and exposure. These combined hardships magnified the human cost of operational collapse and reinforced the inevitability of capitulation. Breakout attempts in these final days were largely ineffective. Small groups of soldiers attempted to escape through gaps in German lines, navigating forests, rivers, and destroyed infrastructure under constant threat of artillery and air attacks. While some individuals and units managed to break free temporarily, most were recaptured, destroyed, or forced back into the shrinking pocket. The efficiency and responsiveness of German forces, coupled with air and artillery superiority, ensured that the majority of escape attempts failed. These efforts, while demonstrating courage and determination, could not overcome the structural and operational dominance of the encircling forces. By late October, organized resistance effectively ceased, and the Southwestern Front faced mass capitulation. German units occupied remaining strongpoints, and the surrender of isolated Soviet formations became widespread. The operational success of the encirclement was a testament to the effectiveness of combined arms, coordination, and air-ground integration. Yet the victory came with a profound human cost. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and countless civilians endured displacement, starvation, and trauma. The collapse of Soviet resistance at Kiev remains a stark example of how operational brilliance, tactical innovation, and relentless pressure can converge to produce decisive outcomes in modern warfare, while simultaneously exacting a devastating toll on human life. The final capitulation underscored the intersection of strategy, operational art, and human vulnerability. While the Wehrmacht achieved a near-perfect encirclement, the human suffering it caused revealed the broader consequences of mechanized warfare. The experiences of soldiers and civilians alike illustrate the complex relationship between operational success and humanitarian impact, highlighting how speed, coordination, and firepower can simultaneously achieve military objectives and impose profound human costs. The Kiev encirclement thus remains one of the most significant and sobering examples of how operational planning, execution, and human endurance interact under the pressures of total war. Chapter 15: Aftermath and Strategic Implications. The aftermath of the Kiev encirclement in October 1941 marked a turning point on the Eastern Front, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The capture of the Southwestern Front was a catastrophic loss for the Soviet Union, not only in terms of manpower and equipment, but also in its psychological and strategic impact. Over 600,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, making it one of the largest encirclements in military history. Entire divisions ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces, and the Red Army was forced to reconstitute units, reassign commanders, and reevaluate operational strategy. The sheer scale of the defeat exposed vulnerabilities in Soviet command structures, logistics, and coordination, revealing weaknesses that the Germans would attempt to exploit in subsequent operations across the Eastern Front. From a strategic perspective, the German victory at Kiev temporarily shifted the initiative firmly into Wehrmacht hands. The successful encirclement demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations, integrating armored columns, mechanized infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe air support. The ability of German forces to coordinate rapid, precise maneuvers allowed them to trap and neutralize a significant portion of the Red Army, creating a model for subsequent encirclements later in the campaign. This operational success reinforced German confidence in blitzkrieg tactics and validated the strategy of deep penetrations followed by rapid encirclement, which had already proven effective in Poland and France. The Kiev operation showcased the full potential of mechanized warfare, highlighting how speed, coordination, and integrated air support could achieve decisive results against even well-defended opponents. The human cost of the encirclement also had far-reaching implications. Soviet soldiers faced extreme losses, with entire regiments captured or destroyed, leaving only fragments of surviving units. The psychological impact of surrender, death, and deprivation rippled through both the military and civilian population, contributing to a climate of fear and uncertainty. Civilians caught in the encirclement endured displacement, starvation, and exposure, with towns and villages left devastated by artillery and air bombardments. These consequences forced the Soviet High Command to reconsider defensive strategies, emphasizing the need for more flexible, mobile formations capable of avoiding encirclement and responding dynamically to German advances. The Kiev catastrophe became a case study in both operational planning and human endurance under extreme duress. Logistical considerations in the aftermath were equally significant. The capture of such a large number of troops, equipment, and material by German forces represented a substantial gain, although the Wehrmacht faced the challenges of processing prisoners and securing captured territory. For the Soviets, the loss of material, including tanks, artillery, and supplies, created immediate shortages that affected subsequent operations along the Eastern Front. Replacement of personnel, reorganization of surviving units, and rebuilding of logistical networks became urgent priorities. The encirclement highlighted the critical role of logistics in modern mechanized warfare. Losing not only personnel, but also the means of sustaining operations can compound the strategic consequences of battlefield defeat. The strategic repercussions also extended to broader German planning. The success at Kiev allowed Hitler and his commanders to consider further deep operations into Soviet territory, shifting attention toward the push for Moscow and the continued advance into Ukraine. The psychological boost for German forces, combined with the demonstration of operational efficiency, encouraged confidence in continued blitzkrieg tactics. At the same time, the scale of the victory prompted careful attention to managing occupied territory, supply lines, and prisoner populations, logistical and administrative challenges that would continue to shape German operational planning throughout the campaign. The Kiev encirclement thus influenced not only immediate tactical outcomes, but also broader operational and strategic decision-making. Soviet military doctrine was profoundly affected by the lessons of Kiev. The loss highlighted the dangers of rigid defensive deployments, overconcentration of forces, and insufficient mobile reserves. It became clear that static defensive lines were highly vulnerable to deep mechanized penetrations, and that the ability to conduct flexible, mobile defense, with reserves positioned to counter enemy thrusts, was essential. Subsequent Soviet planning emphasized decentralization of command, rapid reaction forces, and the need to maintain lines of communication even under severe operational pressure. While the immediate aftermath was devastating, the experience at Kiev contributed to the evolution of Soviet operational art, which would later prove instrumental in turning the tide of the Eastern Front. The political and propaganda implications of the encirclement were also notable. For Germany, the victory at Kiev was a significant morale boost and a demonstration of military superiority, showcased to both domestic and international audiences. For the Soviet Union, the defeat was a sobering lesson in the cost of strategic miscalculation and the vulnerabilities of operational overextension. Leaders in Moscow were forced to reassess the readiness of their forces, the adequacy of training, and the efficiency of logistical and command structures. The lessons learned would shape both military reform and strategic planning, informing not only immediate responses but also long-term adjustments to the conduct of war on the Eastern Front. The aftermath of the Kiev encirclement thus represented a convergence of military, logistical, psychological, and strategic factors. The operational brilliance of the German forces, combined with the vulnerabilities of the Soviet command, produced a decisive, catastrophic result that shaped subsequent phases of the war. The human cost, logistical disruption, and strategic consequences emphasize the multidimensional nature of modern mechanized warfare, demonstrating how operational success can hinge on integration across land, air, and logistical domains. Kiev became both a cautionary tale and a template for operational analysis, revealing the immense challenges faced by commanders and soldiers in one of the most complex theaters of World War II. The final phase of the Kiev encirclement left enduring consequences that reverberated across both the Eastern Front and the broader conduct of World War II. With the capture or destruction of over 500,000 Soviet troops, the Wehrmacht had achieved a level of operational success rarely seen in modern warfare, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated mechanized offensives combined with air superiority. The immediate tactical victory, however, was inseparable from its long-term strategic and operational implications. For the Soviet Union, the enormity of the loss necessitated a fundamental reassessment of defensive strategy, operational mobility, and the resilience of command structures, shaping the evolution of Red Army doctrine in the months and years to come. One of the most profound implications of the Kiev encirclement was the recognition of the importance of operational depth and flexibility. Soviet forces had concentrated significant elements of the Southwestern Front in a static defensive posture, aiming to protect key cities and industrial regions. While this decision was strategically understandable, it left them vulnerable to rapid mechanized penetration and envelopment. The German success at Kiev underscored the need for dispersed deployment, mobile reserves, and the ability to conduct dynamic defensive operations that could respond to unexpected thrusts. Subsequent Soviet operational planning increasingly emphasized maneuver warfare, elastic defense, and the establishment of secondary lines of resistance capable of absorbing and slowing enemy advances while preserving combat power. The human and psychological costs of the encirclement had equally significant consequences. Soldiers who survived the encirclement, along with those who witnessed the destruction of entire divisions, faced extreme trauma and exhaustion. Morale among surviving troops had been deeply affected, influencing both immediate performance and longer-term cohesion. Civilians trapped within the encirclement suffered displacement, loss of property, starvation, and exposure, creating enduring social and economic consequences for the region. These human factors highlighted the intersection between military operations and societal impact, emphasizing that operational success is inseparable from the treatment and fate of the people affected by the conflict. The scale of suffering reinforced the necessity for careful planning and the preservation of human resources in subsequent engagements. Strategically, the encirclement influenced the trajectory of the German campaign in Ukraine and the wider Eastern Front. The destruction of the Southwestern Front removed a significant obstacle to the Wehrmacht's advance into central Ukraine and toward the approaches to Moscow. German commanders, buoyed by the success, were encouraged to continue deep penetrations, leveraging speed, mechanized formations, and coordinated air support. However, the operational triumph also came with challenges, including the management of prisoners, the security of extended supply lines, and the logistical strain of occupying vast territories. While the encirclement showcased the potential of blitzkrieg tactics, it also highlighted the necessity of consolidating gains and maintaining operational sustainability in the aftermath of major victories. The Soviet response to the encirclement reflected both immediate damage control and longer-term doctrinal evolution. The Red Army had to reorganize surviving units, rebuild command hierarchies, and address critical shortages of equipment and personnel. Lessons learned from the Kiev disaster informed changes in strategic deployment, the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, and the need for enhanced coordination across operational levels. Soviet planners recognized the dangers of overconcentration and inflexibility, initiating reforms to improve communication, mobility, and responsiveness. These changes would later be instrumental in the Red Army's ability to recover from early setbacks and mount effective counteroffensives, demonstrating how catastrophic defeats can catalyze institutional learning and adaptation in wartime. The encirclement also had profound implications for German operational thinking. While the Kiev victory validated the use of deep encirclements, combined arms operations, and the integration of air power, it highlighted the limitations of overextended advances and the logistical pressures associated with rapid territorial gains. German commanders were forced to balance the desire for operational brilliance with the practical realities of maintaining supply lines, occupying territory, and controlling large numbers of prisoners. The lessons from Kiev informed subsequent planning for operations in the East, illustrating that tactical and operational success must be balanced with logistical sustainability and strategic foresight. Beyond the battlefield, the Kiev encirclement influenced propaganda and political narratives. For Germany, the victory was portrayed as a demonstration of military superiority and operational efficiency, boosting morale at home and reinforcing confidence among Axis partners. For the Soviet Union, the defeat was a stark reminder of vulnerability and the need for resilient defensive strategies. Leaders in Moscow were compelled to address both the practical consequences of the loss and its symbolic impact, reinforcing determination to resist and adapt. The encirclement became a reference point for the Red Army, shaping both internal military reforms and broader strategic communication to maintain morale and cohesion under extreme adversity. In conclusion, the aftermath of the Kiev encirclement exemplifies how a single operational event can generate ripple effects across tactical, operational, strategic, human, and political dimensions. The German victory demonstrated the power of mechanized warfare, air superiority, and coordinated operations, while the Soviet defeat revealed vulnerabilities in deployment, command, and logistics. The lessons learned influenced subsequent planning, doctrinal evolution, and the broader conduct of the Eastern Front. The Kiev encirclement remains a case study in the interplay between operational brilliance, human cost, and long-term strategic consequences, illustrating the profound complexity of modern warfare and the enduring impact of decisive engagements on the course of history.